a lot of people, and I think bishops are some of the worst, who think that the bishop's authority is just whatever the bishop envisions his authority to be, right? That there are no limits on the bishop's authority, but it isn't true. The bishop has a role in overseeing the liturgy and implementing the liturgy, but he's not the legislator for the liturgy. And the bishop can't regulate the liturgy simply by what his preferences are. You're not to create the diocese in your image of the way you want to do Mass, not to implement my vision of what liturgy looks like. That's not the point. The bishop's goal should always be, how does this liturgy, how does what I'm doing build up the holiness of the people of God? That is the primary goal that he should be looking at.
Thank you for being with us.
Oh, you're welcome.
I wanted to start by just asking kind of a very general question. We're going to be jumping into a lot of specifics. And I'm going to make sure I don't read, I don't want this to be like an interrogation, like a whole bunch of.
You've got a little book there.
I do.
You are a lawyer. You're about to do your cross-examination.
Exactly. Well, actually, that's probably a good way for us to start is when I was searching for somebody who could handle the general subject matter of a bishop's authority in regards to priests, particularly pastors, but all priests in his diocese under his care. I was trying to find somebody who kind of had an expertise in that. So why don't you explain kind of how you've developed this expertise, and also beginning with your civil law background, because actually that was the thing that said, that's the guy I want to talk to, because being a civil lawyer, I kind of look at things through that lens. So give us a little bit about your background, and why you are the guy to talk to on a lot of these kind of subject matters, because a lot of canon lawyers are not familiar with this subject.
No, that's true. And I've dealt with it a little bit in a number of different ways. Just to give you my background a little bit, obviously a Dominican priest, a member of the province of St. Joseph. But before that, went to law school, University of Chicago. I had Lena Kagan was teaching there at the time. I had her for Civ Pro.
Really?
There was this young professor who was there. He was just an adjunct. Nobody really knew him very well. Barack something or other.
Oh my gosh. Are you serious?
Yeah. He was not a professor. He was not a full professor. He was an adjunct. He had just written his book on his father. I forget the name of it. But he was there. Just after I graduated, he went off to, was elected to the
Senate?
State Senate.
Okay.
The State Senate.
State Senate.
And went from there to the U.S. Senate.
So he was a community organizer or whatever he was doing.
With the church, with Catholic Charities. I think he had done some work with Catholic Charities there early on in the Archdiocese of Chicago. Yeah.
A lot of people don't know that the Chicago Law Schools, that's one of the best law schools in the country.
Yeah,
people don't know that, but it's one of the hardest ones to get into.
Yeah, it was. They let me in, but it was a great school. I had, I will say, a great legal education at the University of Chicago. So I said I often say the University of Chicago taught you how to think like a lawyer, and it has always served me very well. Thinking through critically an issue, examining an issue, able to we used to call issue spot, to be able to identify where the legal issues are. When I teach canon law, as I'll get to in a second, I teach canon law. I said, nobody comes to you as a pastor and says, "Dear Father, I have a canon 1095 problem." This just doesn't happen. They tell you a story, and you have to listen to the story and say, well, what part of this is a legal part that I can deal with? And the pastors aren't lawyers, so I have to discern that a little bit. But at the University of Chicago, the critical thinking and the legal critical thinking was very, very, very helpful, I think, even if I wasn't a full-blown disciple of law and economics, which was big at the university when I was there. Chief Judge Posner and the rest was still taught me to think through these things very logically, which I was very grateful for. And I went from there to practice at a large international law firm called Sidley & Austin, which is where Barack was he worked there many years before I did. It's the law firm where he met his current wife.
Wow.
So he and Michelle met while they were both young lawyers at Sidley & Austin. But I practiced in the very different group than he did. I practiced in the corporate securities group. I think I mentioned this to you earlier. My job was to help rich people get richer, help companies buy and sell each other, worked for a number of large, a number of large deals. I think my largest was a $5 billion deal, and this was back in the late 90s. I didn't do it. I just assisted on it. I was too young of a lawyer to do that myself, but had a great time. But while there, I was asked by a little small company out of Connecticut to work in-house for them while I was still at the firm. So
the little light bulb company?
A little light bulb company called GE. From light bulbs to nuclear weapons. We bring the thing to life. So I was living in Chicago at the time, and so we'd gone up to Milwaukee in the winter where I knew no one. And as any Chicagoan will tell you, Milwaukee is just like Chicago, only smaller and without all the fun. So had a lot of time to myself. And as I often say when I'm asked about it, the first time I actually started praying about my vocation, the rosary my Nana, my grandmother had given me, started praying a lot more, praying the rosary a bit more. And came to I thought about priesthood when I was much younger, when I was in high school, went away from it when I decided I wanted to be a lawyer. And then I loved the law. I loved working with Sidley. I really liked being a lawyer, but really discerned that God had different plans. And so I was very involved with a church in Chicago you may have heard of called St. John Cantius.
Oh, yeah.
I entered there, which was then a very new community. They were just the Society of St. John Cantius back then. Entered them for a while. Enjoyed the guys there very much, enjoyed what they're doing, and really loved what they were doing there. But it wasn't the best fit for me, and I think we both knew it. And then eventually, while I was away at seminary, met some Dominicans, and from there went right into the Dominican novitiate. So into the Dominican novitiate, our House of Studies in Washington. Was a priest at our, well, we don't have the parish anymore, but a little St. Thomas Aquinas in Zanesville, Ohio, by the Y Bridge there. Great people down there. Wonderful place. And then they decided I didn't have enough schooling yet after I graduated, 29th grade or whatever it was. So they sent me for more schooling in Rome, where I got my license in canon law and my doctorate in canon law. And then taught in California for a few years at the Archdiocesan Seminary there, St. Patrick's. In San Francisco, Archdiocese of San Francisco, back in D.C., and then now back in Rome teaching canon law at our Dominican University known as the Angelicum, and I've been there for a couple of years now.
So you became a professor rather quickly, it sounds like.
So I went right from canon law school to teaching, but also I did a lot of other things. I was an advocate in a couple of small cases, both in marriage tribunal cases, but also in priest disciplinary cases. I've been judge in penal cases. I've been a judge in marriage tribunal. I do a lot. There aren't a lot of canon lawyers who are religious, so I've done a lot of guidance for religious communities who need some canon law. So I've just done a variety of different work. And then in terms of the topic at hand, my license thesis was on the exercise of authority within the church. So that understanding of the exercise of authority is what really, and sort of academically, it was much of my focus. I've done a lot of work on the notions of authority and the exercises of authority.
All right. So you are by training an expert in this now, and then in your practice, for lack of a better word, I don't even know if you want to call it that, your ministry or your
my side jobs.
Your side jobs. You have been involved with priests who have felt that their bishop has overstepped their authority.
Yeah, both priests and their bishops, as well as religious and their superiors. So I've done exercise of authority kind of in both realms. Okay.
Now, how frequently have you dealt with that?
Oh, dozen or two times, I suppose,
Okay.
a dozen times or so.
Right.
Dozens of different cases, as well as, and sometimes done advising on the other end, but mostly with religious superiors, not with bishops so much, but with religious superiors. Sometimes what I've done are direct cases where there's a formal process and everything. A lot of times it's just brief, what we would call in the legal field, brief advice.
Yeah,
sure. They come to and I give them some ideas to do.
Now, maybe a touchy subject here, but do you think, is it your experience that the issues of religious superiors or bishops overstepping the limits of their authority has increased recently or not?
Increased recently or not? Certainly there's been a lot of overstepping because of the reaction to 2002 and to the sexual abuse crisis. There was a strong reaction. The bishops wanted to be seen as doing something, and I think that prompted many of them to overstep and misunderstand, right? Before 2002, they basically ignored canon law. After 2002, they ignored canon law, but just in the opposite direction, right?
Wow.
So as I often say, before 2002, they just resolved everything in favor of the priest accused. After 2002, they just resolved everything in favor of the one making the accusations.
Right.
Both of these are a problem. They're different problems, but they're both a problem. And the other problem, especially since 2002, in my experience, it's not everywhere, but it's very common, is for bishops to put everything through the lens of child abuse. So any complaint that comes regarding a priest, all of a sudden that gets shunted through the process as if it were a child abuse case, which is a massive problem as well.
Yeah.
So yes, I think it's been a problem. I think it's getting better. I hope. I think Rome has clarified things. I think the Dicastery for the Doctrine of Faith has been good at trying to put some better processes in place to help bishops understand how to do this better and not overstep their bounds. And I think priests are much more likely and have much more support in challenging bishops who greatly overstep their authority. Although I wish Rome were better on this, and they're not.
Is it the case, for lack of using political terms, sorry, but is it the case that do either conservative or progressive bishops overstep more than the other?
No, I wouldn't think so. I don't think that I don't think it's a sense of church politics or ideology. It just depends on the man and his personality. I think you're much more likely to see it when bishops have an overinflated sense of what their role is and the understanding of priestly obedience to the bishop and his own authority. When they misunderstand that, that's when you get into problems. And you can do that in either way, either conservative or progressive.
Well, Father James Martin, sorry, not Father James Martin, Father James Altman.
He's a very different story.
Yeah, that was a slip. Father Altman, who actually endorsed my book, I believe. There's his endorsement right there. But he was probably, at least to my knowledge, probably the most famous case recently of a priest who was removed from, I believe he was pastor and removed as pastor. At least the public opinion of this is that he was making political statements. He was famous on YouTube for saying that, it was a quite catchy line. He said, "I know exactly how many devout Catholics voted for the Democrat last election. I know exactly the number, 0." And then he would make the argument that a Catholic cannot vote for a Democratic candidate because of the abortion stance and other things. Also, he made a lot of statements about the COVID-19 vaccines, which I don't know everything he was saying there. But he was removed, canceled, for lack of a better word. Do you know anything about that case?
I know a little bit about it. I will say I do think the bishops can, particularly if he's preaching from the pulpit, to order the priest to stay away from political issues. I do think I understand the issue. I'm certainly the Democrat National Platform, party platform with regards to abortion and euthanasia and marriage and a whole host of issues are directly contrary to church teaching. It's another matter from saying that Catholic, it is always immoral to vote for a Democrat candidate.
Well, certainly not, because the church teaches that you can vote for the lesser of two evils.
Yeah.
Right? So I could easily, I've told my kids, unless I'm misunderstanding this, I could see in the future, before I die as an old man, I could see myself voting Democrat because I could see the Republican Party becoming just as bad.
Yeah, they're starting to.
And so, I easily see that to where now I'm voting for the lesser of two evils, right? So, so it's not like an objective thing, in terms of time and issues and candidates. It's complicated. So, but can the bishop regulate what a priest says from the pulpit?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Help us with that.
So, the bishop has an authority with regards to, he's the chief shepherd of the flock. So certainly with regard to the message that's going out into the church and the way that's being messaged, I think he can direct that. And so if he's hearing a priest saying things that he thinks are problematic, and maybe even contrary, or at least not a full elucidation of the faith, can correct him, and often should say, look, what you're saying is not quite correct, and so you need to stop saying that. I do think he has the authority to say that. Depends a little bit on the issue, but it would have to be somehow related to matters of faith and morals and the way in which faith and morals are presented by a priest. Absolutely, the bishop can regulate the way faith and morals are presented by the priest. If he's doing a movie review of Gladiator 2, can the he say, no, I want you to give a positive review because I like it, not a negative review. That's obviously outside the scope.
So faith and morals, kind of like the magisterial authority.
Yeah.
Now, but where in
and again, because he's preaching, and now the law gives priests the right by law to preach during Mass, so you don't need a faculty to do it. The faculty is given to them by law, but bishops can revoke that faculty for good reasons. So if you're in the pulpit, if you're preaching at Mass and you're preaching in a way that the bishop finds a problem, now the bishop has the reason to do it. He can't just do it because he doesn't like you. But he has to have a reason to it, and it's got to be related to that sort of the message that you're giving. But he can pull that faculty from you.
All right, so there's a distinction here. So, like, if a pastor's preaching something that the bishop doesn't like, where is that authority? Like, how is that documented? How is that found in canon law? Is it like case law or statutory law in a civil context? Where is that authority? So the bishop pulls out and says, here, pastor, boom, that's my authority right there.
Yeah, so book 3 of the code is about the teaching function of the church, and it's where you find the canons on preaching, and in book 3 and book 2 really as well, which is on the hierarchical structure of the church. It makes it clear that the bishop is kind of the chief shepherd. He oversees that sort of the teaching function, which is preaching is part of the teaching function of the church. And there's no question he has the ability to oversee it. And one of the mechanisms that he has at his disposal is precisely that faculty to preach, which can be withdrawn. And he can, in fact, withdraw it.
He can withdraw that.
Now, I will say he can. It's harder with pastors, right? Pastors have certain rights in law.
Yes.
Because they have an office that gives them lots of rights in law. I don't know whether a lot of priests, I will say this, if you're a pastor, I will say that you're right now, if you're listening to me and you're a pastor and you get accused of something, don't resign. Right? But that's the one thing that you have, because you have all sorts of rights given to you by law as a pastor that associates just don't have.
Yes.
So it's harder to do that when you're a pastor. You really have to remove them, and there is a special process for removing pastors.
It's one of my questions.
Yeah, it's a longer. It's doable. It's a longer process. It involves a lot of dialogue between the bishop and the local pastor. The bishop also has to consult. He's a group of senior priests that are kind of on retainer that he has to consult with before he does that. So it is a long process that should be done for very good reasons, because the church's view is pastors should be stable. They should not be easily removed, and they should not be removed for light reasons, but they can be removed.
Well, that was on way down low in a separate section of my questions, but let's go ahead and get in that. Then I want to get into some liturgical issues. Sure. But since we've just talked about canceled priests, we've just talked about, restricting a priest, what he's saying from the pulpit. What is the process? And I have a little bit of experience with this with a priest that I knew who was essentially reaching a disability with alcoholism and even dementia, and the question of whether he would be removed as pastor. And I remember how, like, in my opinion, the authorities were dragging their feet. But that's how I learned this is tricky business.
It's a very tricky business.
And so help us understand the canonical process for removing a pastor from his position.
Yeah, I'd have to look at the code just to remind myself of all of the details, but I can give you sort of a rough sketch of it. Normally what it involves is, and there are reasons given in the code for the removal of a pastor. And sometimes you can be removed even if it's no fault of the priest. So, for example, if there's, for some reason, an animosity builds between the pastor and the people just aren't receiving the pastor, even though he's done nothing wrong, that actually can be a reason to remove him as pastor. So, and then it's not an exhaustive list. So it's just a list of the sort of main sort of, the code says, here's some reasons you can remove a pastor, and other reasons that should be as grave as this, right?
So isn't like financial management one of them?
Yeah. So if he's a poor administrator of the goods of the parish, and often you run into that. If you're falling into dementia, usually falling into some issues with regards to financial administration.
And then also, I do recall, like, if there was, like you were saying, this hostility between, and that can arise from different issues.
Yeah, it could be the people's fault, but for some reason, it's harder to remove the people from the parish.
Right. So then the bishop has to.
So normally he writes to the priest and sort of explains the situation and asks the priest to resign, saying, "This is the issue. It's a problem. I'd like you to resign. If not, I'll consider removing you from the post." And then there are some time limits involved in which the priest can make his own case. He can say, "Look, this is why I don't think you should resign. Here are the facts that you're missing." So there can be some correspondence. And then I think the bishop has to write him a second time saying, "I've gotten what you have said. I'm still, if you don't want to," and if he's saying, if he's priest is wrong, he's usually saying, "I'm not going to resign." So, or the time limit has passed. And so the bishop writes, "Well, you're obviously not going to resign. You've told me so, the time limit has passed. But I really want you to be removed. So I'm going to remove you from office." So he gives them another chance to do it. Like I said, there are a group of senior priests that he has to have already named.
Yes.
So he has to consult with them at the time to bring the case to them.
Do you know what you call that group of priests?
There is no name for it in the code, but it is just.
I think it says he has to consult with two priests or something.
Yeah, it's a small committee of senior priests. I think it just refers to experienced priests in the diocese. I think I'd have to double check the language of the code, but something like that in the code that he's got to consult with. And if he consults with them and he still feels, he just consults with them. He doesn't need their consent. But certainly if they're both saying, "No, he's good, leave him on, give him another chance," I think it would behoove him not to ignore them. But if those other priests agree with him that this is a problem and the solution to the problem is to remove the pastor, then he can go forth and then issue a decree that formally removes him from the office. Now, the priest can, again, appeal from that. And as soon as he appeals that decree is stayed, basically. So he maintains his position, his office, then while he takes recourse. So it's hierarchical recourse. So again, he can take that case to the Holy See.
So, I think laymen are surprised at that because they hear that their pastor was transferred to another parish.
Well,
those are voluntary. They don't realize that.
Well, it's not voluntary.
Help me with that.
There's still a process for it. It's an easier process. It's easier to transfer, which is why it was done so often in the past. But there still has to be a process for it.
I thought a pastor had to agree, "Okay, I'll leave St. Anne's and go to St. Matthew's,"
Oh, right. So no, there's still a process. So the bishop can transfer him to another office. But it's still going to be a pastor somewhere else. So a lot of times, from the bishop's point of view, that doesn't solve the problem; it just moves the problem.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's much. There's still a process involved, but it's much easier to transfer a pastor than to remove him from office.
Okay, so the bishop, does there have to be these kinds of circumstances of conflict with it? He can just.
He has to have a reason. So he has to have a just reason. There's got to be some good reason, and he has to elucidate that.
Could it be just like, "Hey, this parish up in the mountains needs a pastor now because we have a priest shortage, so you're moving there"?
Yeah, it could be. He does have to do some consultation work. He has to do sort of his due diligence. He usually has to talk to the person who's being affected. So he's got to usually talk to the priest who's going to be transferred before he does that. So there does have to be some administrative process that he does, some due diligence that he does, to sort of justify the reason for doing it. But then he can exercise the transfer.
Okay. All right. So so it would be even easier for an associate pastor, parochial vicar, I guess you call.
They serve at the will of the bishop. He can remove them at the drop of the hat. Basically, he just has to have a reason.
And the pastor doesn't have any authority in that situation.
No,
I didn't think so.
Because he's not appointed by the pastor; he's appointed by the bishop.
Yeah,
and the bishop can even, the bishop can appoint. He can appoint an associate and limit his duties. He can, for example, you sometimes used to see this in the past. I assign so and so to the parish part-time.
Right.
And with part-time service in the high school. Or I assign him to the parish, but only to work with Hispanic ministry, right? So you can limit his work, and the bishop could limit his work and the associate's work in the parish.
Right. Okay. Now let's move to the liturgy. Okay.
Yes.
And I'd say that's the biggest part of what I really wanted to get at with you. And I have just a whole list of different kinds of questions. And I suspect, Father, that the answers to all these questions are basically the same, but forgive me for just kind of going through them.
Yeah. Well, let me just preface it with something before that I probably should have raised before and to make clear. A lot of people, and I think bishops are some of the worst, who think that the bishop's authority is just whatever the bishop envisions his authority to be, right? That there are no limits on the bishop's authority, but it isn't true, right? There is a principle in canonical law called the principle of legality, and it's an important understanding, and that is authority is exercised in accordance with law.
Yes.
Right? Not according to the Latin word for the will is the arbitrum, right? This is where we get the word arbitrary. From, right? So the authority based solely on the arbitrum is what we would call an arbitrary exercise of the law. This is not what bishops should be doing, particularly in regards to the liturgy, because who has responsibility for the liturgy? It is the Supreme Pontiff. Right, because the liturgy is universal. So the bishop has a role in overseeing the liturgy and implementing the liturgy, but he's not the legislator for the liturgy, right? He simply, as a effect, its steward. So he must do so in accordance with universal law. And the bishop can't regulate the liturgy simply by what his preferences are. And I say this to the priests I teach all the time. There's lots of instances of the law where it says you do things for pastoral benefit. As I always say, that doesn't mean the benefit of the pastor.
Right.
It's the benefit of the people. And the same with the bishop, right? The bishop's goal should always be, how does this liturgy, how does what I'm doing build up the holiness of the people of God? That is the primary goal that he should be looking at. And so do I implement the law that I've given with regards to liturgy so as to lift up the people of God, not to implement my vision of what liturgy looks like. That's not the point. And I would say that on both sides, whether you're progressive or whether you're traditional, you're not to create the diocese in your image of the way you want to do Mass, right? It's about what the law of the liturgy is, and because that is executive in nature. Executive means you execute. What do you execute? The law from the legislator, that is from the Pope. So the bishop's job is to execute, to put into force what's there in the liturgical law. So it's important to have that, I think, preface. So the bishop's authority, especially on something like the liturgy, is not unlimited. It's not whatever he wants, but it's in carrying out the vision of the liturgy.
Do you mind if I ask some specific questions
in
light of that?
Yep.
Can a bishop mandate or prohibit the practice of ad orientem?
There's been some discussion about this, and part of the problem is, and you can see this in some writings when the translations first came out. The translation in English with regards to orientation, I think, was initially quite bad. And I think we've recognized it as quite bad. The Latin is a little tricky, and the English translations were quite bad. So it's very clear, and the Holy See in writings from the now Dicastery for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments have made clear that there is no preference in orientation in the law, right? The law...
Do the rubrics say turn and face the people?
Yeah, right. There are a number of times when it turns the face of the people. You might already be facing the people at that time. But obviously... It's the liturgy was done as an adaptation of the previous liturgy in which the priest rarely faced the people, so he's always having to turn around. So you've got that then maintained then in the new rite. The liturgy there's certainly no question that the Reform of the Liturgy wanted to give more, or at least give the option of Mass facing the people. It's very clear one of the intentions of the Mass. But I will say that
you mean of the Novus Ordo as it was dictated back in the 60s?
In the 70s,
the original.
More the 70s, the 60s, 70s. And you see that with the removal of a little bit of the altar from the reredos. Yes. Although the original intent of that was not Mass facing the people, but so you could incense all the way around the altar. That was the idea of the moving of the altar away from the reredos. Was the incensation of the altar. But then also a permission to do that. Now, I will say one of the big problems that we suffered in the United States and in lots of parts of the world is that option then became mandatory. But there was a famous case, Monsignor Schuler, St. Agnes out of Minneapolis, long-time pastor of St. Agnes out there, responsible for about half the vocations in Minneapolis at one time. They would always come, the liturgy office, the people in the liturgy office would always come to him and say, Monsignor Schuler, you need to turn your altar around. He would always say, show me in the rubrics where it says I have to turn my altar around. And then they would go away. And they would come, Monsignor Schuler, I have to turn your altar around. Well, they never turn the altar around. The altar is still facing east. So so there's nothing in, and I would say at this point, and this is one of the things that bishops are facing, is you've got younger priests who have a much better understanding of the liturgy and the history of the liturgy, and I think the anthropology of worship, that are much more likely to appreciate ad orientem worship. I will say, as a person who I much prefer I much prefer ad orientem worship as a priest, because it allows me to focus better on what it is that I'm doing as a priest, and the symbolism of me at the head of the people, facing the altar, I think just provides a lot more. It's just more natural to me in the scope of the liturgy. So I do think you have this, but the problem is a lot of the people now for 50, 60 years don't understand that and don't see that, and are just find it strange. And so the bishop, I think, is in some ways trying to deal with the uproar of the people. Sometimes you get a little bit of uproar when pastors try to implement that a little bit too quickly without enough catechesis, and that it can cause some strife. And I know there's some bishops, Rome hasn't corrected them, but have tried to ban this. In the United States, this was a particular law in the United States. I think it still is.
What was the law?
Filmed masses cannot be ad orientem. I think the U.S. bishops got a recognition for that, so that filmed masses you can't do ad orientem back in the 80s, when there was great opposition to it back then, mostly because of EWTN. But otherwise, the Holy See has made clear that you can do either. Neither is preferred in the law. There's no prohibition. And if there's no prohibition, I don't understand why a bishop thinks he can prohibit it in one case or the other. I know that there's some U.S. bishops, even cardinals in the U.S., who have attempted to do so. I do think that's outside of the realm of their authority.
So role play with me.
Mm-hmm.
You're a pastor. You say the Mass ad orientem. Your bishop calls you or comes sees you and says, I want you turning around and facing the people from now on. What do you say?
What I would say to the bishop is, well, then put that in writing and issue a decree, and then I will take recourse from it. We'll go from there, and we'll let Rome decide.
Okay. All right.
And because on that too, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. There is, I think, as well, an misunderstanding with regards to priestly obedience to the bishop. One, I think there's the mistake in which the people always talk about the priest's vow of obedience to the priests don't make a vow of obedience to the bishop. They make a promise of obedience to the bishop according to law. And so you sometimes get people who mistakenly, and there's a certain society or company that puts itself in the presence of Jesus, or at least did in their name, that projects a view of obedience that I think is problematic, that is far too will-based, voluntaristic, and that's often sort of been infused in understandings of obedience within the diocesan context. The priest owes the bishop obedience with regards to the proper role of his ministerial activity within the diocese, and according to law. The idea that you owe obedience to a bishop in a kind of personal capacity is not the case, and it's not the law, and it's not the way we should think about it. And the idea that you should owe obedience to the bishop simply, the bishop commands and then my will moves to agree, is not the case either, right? You've got an intellect, and you've got to understand what's going on, and you have a right to examine what's going on, and you have a right to examine whether or not the bishop is exercising authority outside the scope of exercising his power outside the scope of his authority, outside of law, and to raise that with him and to say to him, look, this is outside of the scope of your authority, either because it's outside of the ministerial capacity that I have. I'm not your slave, bishop. I am a priest in your diocese, that's all. Or it's outside of the scope of law, in that the law doesn't give you an authority to do what you're doing. And I think the priests shouldn't ever see raising those issues as contrary to obedience.
Yes.
With that, I will say one should always try to seek the best, right? When the bishop is commanding you asking you to do something in your ministerial capacity, you should do your best to understand that in a way that's legal. You should try to do your best to understand the good that the bishop is trying to bring about with what he's doing to you. But as I tell my priests, you have a conscience too. And you have to obey your conscience as well. And if that comes into conflict with what the bishop is demanding of you, you have a right, and I think sometimes an obligation, to raise that with him, to ask him to withdraw, to explain to him why he should, and then, if necessary, to seek recourse from a higher authority.
What about how communion is distributed and received? So in regards to, there's some distinctions here, I know, but receiving on the hand versus the tongue, and then also receiving on the knees versus standing. What authority does a bishop have over the practice within a parish?
So there is a norm that's in the general instruction, the adaptations to the United States, and that is Catholics in the United States receive standing after making a bow of the head. So when you come up to the communion, you make a bow of the head. The priest shows you the hosts, it's the body of Christ. You say Amen. You have the right under law to receive either on the tongue or in the hand. Either one is fine. There's no preference in the law for either. You cannot be denied for communion for receiving one way or the other. I understand that there were some attempts to do so during COVID.
I was going to ask that.
I will say that, law wasn't written in expectation of a worldwide global pandemic.
Right.
I also think that we got bad information about some of the disease control authorities with regards to the likelihood of the spread of this through communion. And so I think there was a lot of overreaction, particularly to communion on the hand. The idea that by simply barely touching someone on the hand or on the tongue that you could spread this was crazy. I remember I saw this when a bishop who was taken away with all this COVID stuff. And many of the communicants where he was at received on the tongue. And so I was incredible, just slathered the germ stuff all over. I mean, it was dripping, literally dripping off his hands as he's giving communion to the people, because he was so horrified at the thought that he would, if you know how to give communion on the tongue, right, you can do it without touching anything. I do it all the time. It's not that hard. It's easier. I will say it is easier when they're kneeling. Oh, it's gotta be. It's gotta be. We always sometimes you get some tall. I will say I have done this. I've gotten people who are so tall. I say I can't, and we want to receive on the tongue and are like towering over me. I say, would you please kneel?
That's the thing.
That's the only way I can give it to you.
It kind of drives me crazy when I have a Eucharistic minister and it's a 75-year-old 5'3" woman.
Yeah.
And I have to. And there's no altar rail, so I should just kneel.
She's not a Eucharistic minister. She's an extraordinary minister of Holy Communion.
You're right. I'm sorry.
The priest is the Eucharistic minister. The others are ministers of communion.
Beautiful. You're right. 100%.
No, you're right. It is an important distinction.
It is very important. No, words matter.
Important distinction.
Yeah.
But with regard to kneeling or standing, again, the ordinary way of receiving in the United States is to receive standing. That's in the adaptations in the general instruction to the Roman Missal for the United States. Again, different countries may have different adaptations. That's the one in the United States. But it's, as I say to students as well, look, there is not a reason to deny somebody communion. When I teach the sacraments, I say, by and large, you don't have an absolute right to the sacraments, but so long as you are properly disposed, asking them at proper times, and are not prohibited by law, you have a right to receive the sacraments. And priests and bishops have no right to invent reasons to deny people the sacraments. To say that somebody cannot receive Holy Communion because they're kneeling is, to me, an incredible violation of the sanctity of the sacrament, an incredible overstep of your bounds, even for a bishop, to deny somebody that for such a ridiculous reason, and for a reason that's just simply not in law, just strikes me as an incredible abuse of authority. If you want to tell them afterwards, look, the normal way in the United States is to stand, you should do that in the future, fine, if you want to do that. But these stories of people being denied communion or ordered to stand, like I just find that just ridiculous. I just don't understand why you're fighting over this. There are much more important things to be worried about than whether the person is receiving standing or kneeling, standing or kneeling. It's just absurd.
If it's an older church or new, if it's a church with altar rails, then it's the architecture therefore is it's there for receiving on the knees. Now, like in our parish, it's optional, but we all line up along.
Sure, lots of parishes do that,
right? Yeah. And so it's optional. But
as I think I was telling you before, our parish in Columbus, or Dominican parish in Columbus, just never stopped receiving at the rail. There was never a time in which people received standing. It's always been at the rail.
Can a bishop tell a pastor to stop using the altar rail?
Well, this is the thing. I just don't understand functionally how that happens. What are you going to do when people just kneel there? Are you just going to ignore them? Because that's what he's doing. He's saying, Pastor, what I want you to do is these people want to come to communion and they want to receive it kneeling. I want you to deny that to them.
Well, it wants to stand in the center and have the two lines coming up just like
And what happens then if they just go to the side and kneel at the rail? Then what's the priest supposed to do? Again, deny them communion? Bishop, if you want to come down here and talk to them, feel free. Come to Mass. Explain to them what's going on. Explain with them what you want to do. But I will say, if I was a pastor and there's somebody at the rail and wants to receive communion, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to give them communion. And I think in conscience I have to. Right? I think that for me that's a matter of conscience, because there's nothing that suggests to me in law or in morals that they're not properly disposed or ready to receive communion. And if that's the case, I don't have any right to deny it to them.
So we're in the nitty gritty. So now we're talking about, I totally get what you're saying about not denying somebody who goes over there and kneels, but where the priest and deacon or whoever, they're ritualistically or routinely distribute communion, because do they go over to the altar rail and wait for everybody to line up, or do they stand in the center? Can a bishop regulate where the priest goes to distribute communion?
That is a very good question. I will say first of all, I hope not. But
it's a specific question. I know it's specific, but I don't think this is fictional.
No, I know it's not fictional at all. So there's a tension here, and there's the two things that you have to keep in mind. That the pastor has an office, right? It has an office with authority. He's not simply the local manager for the bishop, right? He has an office which he exercises according to his own authority there. And I think the bishop needs to respect that. And I think the bishop can't overcome that, or can't overcome that easily. So it'd be interesting to see what Rome had to say about this. I don't know if there's any express understanding from Rome on this. But I would say something as individual as where the priest stands to distribute Holy Communion would seem to me outside of the authority of a bishop with regards to a particular parish. If people disagree with me, you can write in. But that just seems to me something that is very properly under the scope of the pastor. And if the bishop doesn't like it, then he can bring these things together and bring a case to remove him from the office.
It seemed to me that if one bishop can say you cannot distribute communion at the altar rail, then another bishop could say you have to distribute communion at the altar rail.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to respect the people's right to receive standing.
Sure.
So, so they could come up and receive standing and do it.
No, I'm drawing that distinction.
Yeah. But again, this just doesn't seem to me. You had that, and unfortunately, you had that in places like, maybe if he legislated it, maybe if he exercises, that'd be interesting. If he did it as a law, that is, if he executed a law and promulgated it with some as law, then I might be willing to buy. If he just went to the priest and says, as the part of my exercise of my authority and the executive power that I have, regulation of the liturgy, I tell you have to move here rather than here, that I would probably find a little bit more difficult.
All right. So you said regulate it. Your law. What was the word?
So the bishop has the ability to pass law, which is called particular law. So the diocese can have its own set of laws. It can't contradict universal law. It can fill in the gaps a little bit, or it can expand it a little bit. So if he were to pass some of these things as the particular law of the diocese, now that has to go through a process. It has to be promulgated and published and all that sort of thing.
So like liturgical norms. You're saying that a bishop, if he passes a law, could regulate certain liturgical norms
I think
his
so.
diocese.
Yeah, I think so. They couldn't contradict the general instructions or universal law, but they could fill in the gaps, as it were. They could be praetor legem, as it were, but they couldn't be contra legem. They couldn't be against.
Well, then I'm getting specific here, but you're a lawyer, so that's what you do. Can he pass law? Going back to our first question about ad orientem.
I don't think so, because I think that's contra legem.
That would be
because I think the law makes it clear that you can do it either way.
Okay.
And I don't think the bishop could. I mean, again, you have some bishop who disagrees with you. There are bishops in the United States who have attempted to do this. The one case in which they have done this, if my memory is correct, was
being what?
Prohibiting Mass Orientem. I think they got the recognition from the Holy See to be able to do that with regards to the filming of it.
Okay.
I think it was a recognition that because this contradicted, this was a limitation of universal law, restriction of universal law, then they needed the approval of the Holy See.
So getting the approval almost admits that there was
that they don't have the authority.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
No, and I think they don't. I think they don't have the authority to overturn universal law or to, when the law grants a freedom, I don't think the bishops have, as a general matter, the ability to restrict it.
So
universal law.
Passing a law, I know the answer here, but passing a law from a diocesan standpoint, that is different than a bishop releasing a document, a memo, that is his liturgical preferences.
Correct. Law there's a process to it. It involves publication and promulgation, and usually what's called the vacatio legis. There's a period in which the law takes into effect. But there is a definite process to do that, and it's got to be on a general matter that he has authority to issue.
So a pastor or any priest gets a letter, an internal memorandum, essentially, from a bishop that expresses his liturgical preferences. I suspect you would advise any priest to read it seriously with extreme care, try to understand the spirit of what his spiritual father is doing.
What I would put is what's the good that the bishop is trying to bring about here, and how can you cooperate in bringing about the good that the bishop sees here?
Right. But then they need to also understand that that is not per se law.
It is not law. It is, there may be the bishop has executive power in which he can execute the laws, and he can do that by decrees and things.
Sort of like the branches of government. Legislative versus executive.
Well, that's right. The canon law says that there are 3 types of power in the church: legislative, executive, and judicial.
Really?
Yep, absolutely.
Was that around before James Madison wrote the Constitution?
It wasn't in the code. We've only had a code since 1917.
Okay.
I'm not sure if
did we influence the code?
Oh, absolutely. I think so.
Wow.
I think that distinction, that sort of Enlightenment distinction that happened, sort of helped the way we think about the types of law.
I mean, there is something beautiful in that.
Well, yeah.
Tripartite.
So you have the law, that is the legislative power, which is the creation of law. This is how you create law, as legislative power. Executive power isn't the creation of law; it is the carrying, it's the execution. So the executive power always has to find a foundation in the legislative. You can't just execute law unless you're executing law, right? It's not executive unless you're executing law.
Can I tell you a great story on this?
Sure. So
the judge I worked for, which I was telling you about, Judge Robert Conrad.
Is it the same name as the actor?
I don't know.
Bob Conrad was in Hogan's Heroes, maybe? I don't know. Anyway.
It's not him. But
Black Sheep Squadron. Robert Conrad was Black Sheep Squadron.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right. Well, so when he was in his congressional hearing, or I guess senator, before the Senate and answering questions, the Judicial Committee, I guess, on whether his nomination would be accepted to be a federal judge, he used the analogy, being a great athlete himself, and he used the analogy. He said, I'm an umpire as a judge. Yeah. I don't create balls and strikes. I just call balls and strikes. Right. I don't create the rule for what balls and strikes are. I just call balls and strikes based on the facts. And so that was kind of a cool analogy. But then a couple years later, Chief Justice Roberts used the exact same analogy in his Supreme Court hearing.
Now everybody uses it. I will say everybody uses it now.
I think they use it now.
Yeah. I think Amy Coney Barrett used it in hers.
Well, she did after my judge did it. I think he was the creator of this analogy. I do. I think he started this.
Yeah,
anyway.
I mean, the executive power is to execute the law, to make it applicable in concrete cases. The judicial power is to decide controversies. When 2 people have a controversy or clash about how the law applies, then the judge then takes the facts, takes the law, and makes a determination about how to apply the law to these particular facts. But again, like the executive, this is when the bishop issues a memo, he's using it's kind of executive power. Mm-hmm. And the question is what's the law that he's exercising, right? The problem is, again, most bishops just don't think they need that. They think they can just exercise power based on the arbitrum, on their own will. And that's when I think we run into power and the abuse of power that you sometimes see with bishops.
And the canon lawyers in the diocese might be able to help temper the bishop's expectations.
If he listens to them, and if they're well formed.
Yes.
I do say it's one of the benefits I have from being a religious is I'm not directly under a bishop. It's much easier for me to say to a bishop, no. You can't do this. And there is oftentimes a culture, particularly in the presbyter of a diocese, is that strong desire to be obedient to the bishop, which is ordinarily quite good.
It's quite beautiful.
Yeah, and I think most of the priests and young priests that I knew don't want to be. They want to be obedient and have a real habitus of it. But so that when the situation comes in which the bishop, though, is exercising power he doesn't have, it's very difficult for them, and particularly within the chancery, to say no. And I will say that's especially true sometimes among the lay people who, are trying to raise a family based on the meager salary they get from the diocese, and one's job security sometimes gets a lot less if one's questioning their employer the whole time.
Sure. Now, I had this in another question, but I'm just going to ask it now. Do you think, well, first of all, I don't want to go through it now. We'll go through it later. I want to talk about the difference in a religious superior's authority over his order versus a bishop. I don't want to go through that now. But when a bishop is from a religious community, do you think sometimes they get that mixed up?
Oh, absolutely. No question. And again, there was a certain society that was created in the 16th century that I think had very bad views, very problematic views of the nature of religious obedience. And that really kind of spread to lots of religious orders and to lots of understandings within dioceses, which I think can be a problem.
Fascinating.
And I do think that sometimes even religious not of that particular congregation, have that understanding of a kind of almost blind obedience, which as a Dominican, we really just don't have. We have obedience, but it's not like that. And so I think that can sometimes be carried over within from a religious who becomes a superior, because their experience of obedience is obedience within religious life, in which the religious superior has a much wider array of authority over you, because he's affecting not just your ministry, but the life of the community. So he has much more authority within the way you live out your life as a religious, and particularly because that's joined to the vow of poverty. So in many ways, you're dependent on the superior, even for things like permission to buy whatever, right? So there's much more dependence by the religious on the superior, and therefore much more control and authority of the superior over the individual religious. And when that attitude is just taken and not properly examined into the role of the bishop, when the religious bishop thinks that's the kind of obedience that his priests owe to him, then you cause massive problems, because he's simply abusing his authority, because he doesn't have the same authority as a bishop that his religious superior would have over him were he back in the order.
That is an understandable mistake to make, but it is not acceptable.
Oh, it's not acceptable, and I think it's a good reason why, particularly if religious are raised to the level of the episcopacy, particularly as an ordinary, they should be very, very cautious about exercising that authority within the first few years until they need to develop a habitus of religious obedience.
Yes.
They need to develop the habitus of proper episcopal authority, and that is not going to occur overnight. The grace doesn't work that way, and you've got to give it time. And so I think it's very irresponsible for a religious bishop if he takes office, if he takes office as a bishop, to begin sort of asserting his authority that way, at least for the first few years. I really do think he needs time to develop a proper habitus. Now, if there are massive problems within the diocese, maybe I might think otherwise. But a good functioning diocese, I don't understand why a bishop would go, particularly a religious bishop, would go in there and start demanding obedience on things and changes to things when he almost certainly doesn't understand them.
On that note, I have more liturgical questions, but is that sometimes why bishops are assigned? Are they assigned by Rome for a very particular agenda?
That I don't know. I will say
that's speculation. I know it's pure speculation. It's not a fair question to ask a lawyer.
Yeah,
because it's just pure speculation.
I will say Pope Francis has certainly. I don't know if there's an agenda on his part, but he's certainly shown a much greater preference to appoint religious as bishops. I don't know why that is. I mean, he's a religious himself, and that probably has something to do with it. But and I do think he probably doesn't. Always understand and doesn't appreciate the transition that I think that he should with regards to obedience to the bishop as opposed to obedience to religious authority. And certainly I hope it's something, especially since we've had so many religious become Episcopal ordinaries. They have to go. There's like a little baby bishop school that they have to go through.
Yes, I've heard of this. Shortly after, yes.
Yeah.
Right after they're ordained, they go off to baby school.
Yeah,
baby school.
I don't know what the agenda is for that. Knowing the Italians, it's probably nothing particularly useful. But one thing I wish they really would do and think about was with regards to religious, maybe even a special course for religious, and saying helping them to transition from religious obedience to proper episcopal
See, that's
obedience.
a good idea right there.
Yeah, which means the Italians will never do it.
Yeah, that's too bad. Another specific liturgical question.
Yep.
We were talking about receiving of communion and altar rails and this kind of thing. What about distribution of communion under both species? Can a bishop regulate that?
He can limit it. I don't think he can mandate it. If you read the instructions, especially the original instructions for communion under both species, it's fairly limited. There were some times that you did it and times that were recommended, but it's especially a sort of a pastoral decision. That's really the instructions seem really to leave. The idea is the bishop can give you guidelines on when you can do it, and then it's really then the pastor decides as a pastoral model when you should and shouldn't do it. But I don't think the general. I'd have to look at the language a little bit more closely, but I don't think that the general instructions give the bishop the authority to say you must distribute under both species at all masses, because that is not the mind of the instructions. That's not the mind of the liturgy. There are times in which it should be used, and they're fairly broad these days, but I don't think they can be enforced or mandated.
When is it in the church's calendar that Holy Mother Church prefers both species being distributed?
Well, the most important is things like Holy Thursday, Corpus Christi, to couple at their own marriage. There's a couple other specific instances. I mean, theoretically, you can do it on every Sunday. Theoretically, I think you can do it on any day. Right.
I would think that the majority of parishes in this country distribute the precious blood every single Mass.
I will say I think that was probably the case before COVID. I don't know if that's still the case after COVID.
Fair enough.
I think a lot of places withdrew, obviously didn't have the chalice. A lot of them, the state was breathing down their neck, and like California, told them you can't do it. Heck, California was telling us you couldn't sing in church.
Right.
And I think a lot of places either have been slow to bring it back or have not brought it back altogether yet. So I do think it's still there. I still think it's very common. And again, the church does have, from the church's point of view, there's a tension here, and it's a problem. It's one of the things I think that the churches in her instructions fails to adequately appreciate. So there's the sign value from the church about the receiving under both species, because the sign value of both, right? As a sacrament, that sign value is important, right? Both the species of wine, the species of bread. But there's also a sign value, and this is important: the sign value of the reception from the proper minister, that is from the alter Christus, right? So the person who's ordained. So you're receiving the body of Christ from one who acts in the person of Christ. There's a symbol to that. I think that's important. The problem is when you receive from the chalice, Rome seems to think we just have these deacons everywhere. As you often do
there's
in
very
Rome.
few.
So what happens is if you distribute from the chalice, you get this profusion of extraordinary ministers, right? And there's a real question, and I would say that the desire to give under both species does not give sufficient reason to use extraordinary ministers.
I understand.
And I don't think that's widely held, but I do think it's something that's part of the tension of the church, because the ordinary minister is the priest or the deacon. And when you just create all of these extraordinary ministers for the sole purpose of creating the sign value of receiving of the chalice, I do think that creates sort of a tension that's problematic, and a tension in the law, because extraordinary ministers are designed to be truly extraordinary. And there is no need for them to receive under both species. And so you're saying, well, we need all the extraordinary ministers they can receive under both species, but they don't have. It's not needed. It's not an obligation. So
even if it's not that, we have these part of it. When you have a mega church, when you have these massive churches,
sure, you have a lot of those in the South now.
There's more pressure.
Yep.
For communion to be done in 10 minutes versus 25 or 30, or whatever.
Yeah.
First of all, they shouldn't build churches so darn big, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But small is beautiful, whatever. But so I'm going to ask you the exact same question: what is a bishop's authority over a pastor or a parish's use of extraordinary ministers. When the bishop wants more extraordinary ministers because it shows lay people participating, women on the altar, it shows these things that a bishop is trying to push in his diocese. What is the extent of his authority?
I mean, I think it's very clear. I mean, certainly within his own, in the cathedral, he can appoint them. But I mean, the pastor has no. Extraordinary ministers for a stable period have to be approved by the bishop, which means what happens? It means the pastor forwards him the names. The pastor has no obligation to forward names to him for people to be extraordinary ministers, nor I think does the bishop have the authority to order him to forward him names for people to be the extraordinary minister. I think that's outside of the purview of the bishop. I don't think a priest has. I think the law is very clear is that the individual pastor or the priest at the Mass itself has the ability to make the decision as to whether or not there should be an extraordinary ministers.
Yeah.
If the pastor thinks that there is a need one because of a lack of priests or too many communicants, then he can forward names to the bishop to approve them in a stable manner. But otherwise, there's no obligation there. I can't think of anything in the law which allow the bishop to force the pastor to turn over names to him.
Hey, thanks guys for checking out the Conor Gallagher Show. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, or comment, or whatever you got to do to support it. And I appreciate that very much.
What about different topic? This might be different territory.
Sure.
I'm not sure. The use of Latin and Greek responses in the Mass. What is the bishop's authority over that?
Well, so there's only one Greek in the Mass, and that's the Kyrie.
The Kyrie.
He has no authority whatsoever to limit its use. He has no authority whatsoever to limit this is sort of the irony. And the Novus Ordo, there's no ability for him to limit. That Latin is a legal language of the church. I will say I ran into a bishop once who believed that the Editio Typica, which is the Latin version of the liturgy, was only meant to be a model for translation and never meant to be used. I think that's a U.S. bishop who told me this. I think he's an archbishop now. That's just wrong, right? The Latin missal is the missal. It is legal in the entire Latin church. No one has the ability to withdraw the use of the missal in Latin or the use of the missal in Latin. Now, there may be pastoral reasons not to implement it. The second thing is, obviously, there are portions of the missal that the people are meant to know in Latin, right? And they're printed in the missal, right? The people of God should know the Gloria in Latin. It's in the English missal in Latin. The people of God should know the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father, in Latin. It's printed in Latin in the missal. Those are the two things that they should know in Latin, right? Those aren't translated. The same with the Kyrie. So the Kyrie, the Gloria, and the Lord's Prayer, the people should know in Latin. And the bishop has certainly, and the Agnus Dei, the Sanctus, all those things the people should know in Latin. Certainly, the bishop has no authority to limit their use in Latin. And again, so long as you're using a book, a liturgical book that's approved by the Holy See, the bishop doesn't have any authority to limit your use of that book. It's outside of his authority.
Okay, that's good. What about?
But it's a funny irony, though. It's perfectly legal to read in the Novus Ordo. It's perfectly legal to read the readings in Latin. There's nothing to prohibit you.
That's funny.
But the irony is, of course, if you want to do the extraordinary form in your parish,
yeah.
the Holy See says you have to do them in the vernacular. So you've got this weird thing is that if you do the Old Mass, you have to do the readings in the vernacular, but you're perfectly able to do the new rite in Latin, the readings.
Does the Holy See understand that built-in contradiction? Or
I don't think so. I would say, the cardinal prefect of the dicastery, in many ways, I think a good man. My experience is he's a terrible canon lawyer because as a lawyer, one of the things you have to do is you have to look at a piece of legislation or something and sort of think through the process. What are the implications of this? How does this work with other things? And he's not. If you look at what has come out of the dicastery in terms of particularly Traditionis Custodes and all these other things that he wrote, he just doesn't think through like that. And he's clearly not getting the help from any canon lawyer who could provide him some of the guidance on this. So, I mean, I understand what they're trying to do, but sort of the canonical way that they've gone about it from the dicastery has been, I think most canon lawyers would tell you, some of the worst law I've ever read has been coming out of the dicastery for divine worship. I'm not questioning their intentions or their motivations, but the process by which and the practicalities of which they do it is just, I mean, as a lawyer, you just cringe and saying, no, I mean, I was a first year law student. I think I could have written this better.
Yeah. I'm not surprised in the least.
But they have all of these canon lawyers to help them. It's like, but sometimes they just seem so rushed to get things out.
Yeah,
I just don't understand.
And you're being very kind-spirited, assuming that it's a misunderstanding. Other people.
Well, some of it is
just assume that they know exactly what they're doing.
Well, some of it is they could get far more restrictive if they just written it better.
Right.
Like you've written. I'm sorry, but I've been a lawyer most of my life. I know what good legal writing looks like. I also know what bad legal writing looks like. And the Dicastery for Divine Worship as some of the worst legal writing I've just ever seen.
What about the sign of peace? Is that actually in the rubrics?
Yep. Let's offer each other a sign of peace, and then whatever's customary in the area. But it's optional.
Okay, it's listed as optional?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's always optional.
So can a bishop mandate an optional thing?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Just making sure.
Yeah, and I mean, unless they get the recognition from the Holy See, I don't see that he could mandate an optional thing.
Now, we've been talking pretty much everything in regards to the Novus Ordo, but I figured since you were here, just help me that when Rome restricted the Latin Mass, the extraordinary form,
the Missal Paul, the Missal Paulus, or the Missal of John the 23rd.
Yes. Okay. Can I just say Latin Mass for now?
Sure.
Okay. And our book by Dr. Kwasniewski is the Roman Rite.
I ran into him in the airport about a year or so ago. Yeah, I was like, I know you.
Right. He just says it's called the Roman Rite. So we're just in a name problem here. But when the Latin Mass was restricted, there was a hefty debate about what Rome's ability was to restrict the Latin Mass at all.
Yeah.
Do you have an opinion on that?
Well, again, I think you're dealing with a Holy See that sometimes sees, because it comes from that same tradition with regards to authority and obedience, that sometimes sees that in terms simply of the exercise of the will, rather than the exercise of the will in connection with reason. I do think the Pope isn't God. The Pope exercises an authority within the context of the life of the Church, of the society of the Church, which includes its laws as well as its traditions. Certainly, I certainly don't think any Supreme Pontiff would have the authority to simply abolish the Latin liturgy, to say, well, I'm just going to have something entirely new, and we're just going to get rid of everything having to do with the Roman Rite. I just don't think he would have the authority to do that. You would have to have just such a rarefied understanding of papal authority, an understanding of papal authority that the Protestants often accuse us of, that we've often, and for most of our history, denied. So I think that's a great problem. And I think Benedict was of the same view, right? Certainly Benedict did not think that you could completely restrict the missal as it was understood until John the 23rd, right? He didn't think the missal was ever suppressed, and nor did he think it could be. So I tend to sort of agree with them on that. Agree with Pope Benedict XVI on that, and to say that the complete abolition of that missal. I mean, you might be able to do some adaptations to it, and there's probably some necessary adaptations, particularly with the calendar, that should be done. But the complete removal of it would seem to be I would say would be outside the authority of the Supreme Pontiff, because I just do not believe in an unrestricted authority from the Supreme Pontiff with regards to the functioning of the Church, that has to be exercised within the understood society and tradition of the Church.
So the way it was restricted, he didn't annihilate it out of existence, but it was restricted.
Right.
What do you think his authorities over the restrictions?
That is, I think they're strange. I will say they're strange. I do question this restriction on their ability to be said in a parish church. I don't, just as a legal and ecclesiological matter, I don't quite understand what that means. we especially come, particularly after the Second Vatican Council, in an understanding of the life of the church as exercised within the context of the parish, so that the church, in a sense, lives through the parish. And this idea that you're restricting what is lawful and what's been good in the church for millennia, but now that sometimes to be kept out of the parish church strikes me as strange, to say the least, and probably is probably the thing that's the closest I would say would be a problematic exercise of that authority. Now, I will say one of the things I have to be sort of a little bit cautious about is, or at least explain about, is obviously it doesn't affect me. We Dominicans have our own right, and none of that was. I shouldn't say that aloud because they might hear me. None of that was really touched by Traditionis. Edit that out. None of that was really touched by Traditionis Custodes. So there are no restrictions on my ability to say the Dominican Rite Mass the way there is on the Missal of John 23rd.
Turn this way a little bit. Just turn your body other way.
Oh.
So there you go. Cameras are over that way.
Oh, there you go. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So there are so I don't have I was actually out. I was out in the diocese. In Virginia, Northern Virginia, doing the Dominican Rite Mass just yesterday, Sunday. I travel so much, I forget which day it is. So I do think that's a problem. In fact, the other thing that sort of you have to realize is that the Pope is in the exercise of his authority is bound to the notions of natural justice. Because even the Pope in the exercise of his authority has to be aware of the what's due to the people of God in terms of that understanding of natural justice, and works to kind of deny that are problematic because they then start creating this conflict between claims of his papal authority and prerogatives of the Pope against the sort of natural right expectations and desert of the people of God. Mm-hmm. And I think they ran. I said the restrictions on this at a parish church, I think, sort of runs up against that. It really runs the risk of a real violation of the rights and justice of the people of God, and calls into question then some of that exercise of authority. I'll go as far as that. I'm not going to deny that he has the authority to do that. I don't think that I can, but I think they should be more worried about the conflict between that and the rights and justice of the people of God than they have been. And I wish they would have more consideration over that.
Can the Pope tell my pastor whether or not he can advertise the Latin Mass in his bulletin?
Well, unfortunately, the Pope didn't do that.
Okay. That's the rumor. That's the rumor I've heard.
No, well, it was Arthur Roach. It was the Cardinal Prefect who said that. It was in a document without legal authority. Thankfully.
Okay.
So no,
but I think that's an important point there. I think pastors need to be savvy enough to, when they see documents spreading around, they need to ask themselves, is this binding or not? Is this a legal authority? And it's sort of like in law. You can see these regulations and commentaries and stuff, and it doesn't mean it's the exact statute, right? So we have to be good at making sure that we don't interpret.
Some of this was what's called the responsa ad dubium. The responsa ad dubium from the dicasteries, in the dicastery's own words, the dicastery for the doctrine for divine worship and the doctrine of the faith has made clear that its responsa ad dubium do not have the force of law. They give the mind of the dicastery on a particular issue. They should be respected as such, but they don't have the force of law.
Yeah,
and particularly with regard, the bulletin comment was part of a long answer on responsa ad dubium. I have a long description of this, what's his name? I'm forgetting. A journalist, a well-known UK journalist, Catholic journalist, published my kind of discussion of Traditionis Custodes, and I discuss a lot of the legal ramifications in that as well. And I go into some detail in that about the legal force of responsa ad dubium. And there is none. There's no legal force to it, but just the sort of moral force of the mind of the dicastery.
Now bring it down from, we've talked about the Latin Mass in regards to the Holy Father and Rome. Bring it down to the bishop level, right? So what, given these statements from Rome, and you're a pastor in a diocese and your bishop is not a fan of the Latin Mass at all and wants to crack down on it as much as possible, help us understand the pastor's rights in regards to the Latin Mass.
I mean, that's a good question, because again, the drafting of this has not been very good. And when the Holy See promulgates one text and they claim the other text is authority, that's a problem, right? Promulgation, there was an issue in which it said that before a priest could be given permission to celebrate the Mass, the 62 Missal, they had to consult with the Holy See. But at some point, they published a different version when they published the Latin version. But there's a real issue of natural justice in that, and I think it is a real problem from the Holy See. The law is what is promulgated, the text that's promulgated, because that's what is made known to the people, and that was what the people in justice are bound in obedience to. And the Holy See tried to published one thing and then claimed something else was in fact the law. And that seems to me the Holy See really oversteps its bounds. And that's, if their insistence on that, it seems to me violate the natural justice of the people of God. And I think that's a real problem, at least on this issue of whether or not the diocesan bishop needs to seek the permission of the Apostolic See for a priest in the diocese to celebrate the Roman Rite. So I do think it's a problem, right? The problem is that you've gotten a shift in understanding. So Benedict XVI was very clear that he thought it was just the Missal of John the 23rd and the Missal of Paul VI were both expressions of the Roman Rite. And as a priest, you're ordained to do what? To celebrate the Mass. The idea that you can restrict a priest from saying a Mass, especially privately, is just doesn't make any sense, right? Why are you ordaining him? You'd only do that in the case in which you're imposing a penalty, a canonical penalty. So it's the long tradition of the Church is that as a priest, you just have the inherent right to celebrate, at least privately, the Mass. And to withdraw that, it really seems to run counter to the very nature of the priesthood. Obviously, the current Supreme Pontiff and the prefect of the dicastery think otherwise. They think just the opposite, that there is simply a single Roman Rite. Now, historically, of course, they're wrong.
And they would say this is Novus Ordo.
The Missal of Paul VI. Now, of course, they're wrong on that, right?
Now, you want to call it the Missal of Paul VI as opposed to Novus Ordo for a particular reason?
No, it's just clarity.
Just clarity.
But the other thing is, because the Roman Rite is obviously, there are other aspects of the Roman Rite. For example, the Ambrosian Rite, right? Which is not, we can call that
I've heard of
the
that.
Novus Ordo. And there is a newer rite, the Ambrosian Rite, a post-Vatican II reform of the Ambrosian Rite, but it's a part of the Latin Rite. It's part of the Roman Rite. There is now the Ordinariate for the former Anglicans.
Yes.
Right. They have a form of the Roman Rite.
Right.
Right. You can call it a new Novus Ordo. It's a new way of doing the Roman Rite based on the Anglican traditions, but it's all part of it. So the idea,
correct,
and the Holy See has said this a number of times, that there is one Roman Rite. It's just factually not true. And the same is true with the religious orders. We in the Dominican order had our Mass, the Dominican form of the Mass, finds its origins in the 13th century, largely unchanged since the 13th century. In many ways, very similar to the Roman Rite, the Missal of John the 23rd, but in many ways very different. And that was, everybody understood, part of the Roman Rite. Lots of religious orders had that. There were the Spanish had their own rite. There was a Sarum Rite in England before Henry VIII, and so you had all of these variations of the Roman Rite.
Sure.
So this claim that there is, which seems to underlie the current view of Traditionis Custodes, that there is now just one Roman Rite and everything else is just done by permission, just seems to be contrary to facts and contrary really to the traditions of the Church that's existed. But that's clearly the mind of the Holy See. So the idea is, as a priest, you have the right to say the Missal of Paul VI, because that is the Roman Rite, and therefore everything else is given to you not as rights, but as permission. And so that's the way they're viewing it. I do think there are some problems with viewing it that way for the reasons I've stated. One, because I think it's just factually incorrect with regard to the various forms of the Roman Rite. It just isn't true. Mm-hmm. And the other is, again, I do think it's running contrary to the teaching of Benedict XVI, and which I think is more in line with the longstanding tradition of the rights of priests to say the particular mass of the church. And so I do think those restrictions are problematic. I'm not going to say that the Pope doesn't have the authority to limit them, and I'm certainly not going to suggest to bishops that they ignore the Pope's attempts to limit them. But I do wish the Holy See would reevaluate the long-standing traditions and teachings with regard to the ability to say these forms of Mass, and think more about Benedict XVI's writing on these issues as we move forward.
Did John Paul II understand this?
I think so. Now, again, this there were limitations, and I think that's what, in part, he's going back to, is some of the limitations that existed on John Paul II. Part of that, and much of that, was in response to Lefebvre, right? So that there was a reaction, and I think in some ways an overreaction, and much of it very French.
Yeah, understand.
Reaction to the set of Anconists and those for whom the Latin Mass also went part and parcel with the rejection of Roman authority, a rejection of papal authority, which is clearly what Lefebvre did in consecrating bishops without papal mandate, which is a very clear violation of the law. And so and in Europe too, oftentimes, certainly in the past, an appreciation for the older Mass went part and parcel with a kind of royalist tendency in France, and a refusal to accept modern forms of democracy and the like, which caused lots of political problems. Which I always say that. I would say this about, talk about the Roman Rite, and these Europeans would come up and saying, well, you get all these royalists in France, and I was like, this is not the United States. This is not our issue, right? This is what we're dealing with. So stop looking at this through the lens of French ideology, right? The world is not French ideology, but a lot of times that's what's kind of what the Europeans have in mind, is that kind of French ideology, and sort of cover it for the world. So I just don't think it's an issue for us. But he did. I mean, and I think that was their worry, and I think that was the worry under John Paul. I think he much better understood why people had a closeness to it. And I think he better understood, too, the problems of the implementation of the reform and the massive abuses that existed in the implementation of the reform that often led people to desire the older Mass and the stability of the older Mass. I wish the current Holy See took more seriously the severe problem of liturgical abuse. And I think if they did take that more seriously, I think they would see that people would be far less stringent, vocal about demanding the older Masses. I still think people would, but I think people would be less strident about it if they could find a decent Mass in the Novus Ordo in their own diocese, which, for a lot of people into the wasteland of the 70s and 80s, it was just terrible. Terrible.
What about a few more specifics here, real specifics, right? Can a bishop control what kind of vestments a pastor or priest wear?
I mean, so long as they're in accordance with the rubrics, I don't see how.
Could he say no fiddlebacks?
I don't think so. I can't imagine what authority he would claim to be able to do that. I mean, they're not. There's nothing in the GIRM that prohibits them.
What about just like a priest walking around with a beretta on? Is that what it's called, a beretta?
They're not part of the priestly vestiture anymore. I'll take that back. I think they are mentioned in a couple of places. So I don't think you could get rid of them, because I do think they are mentioned at least in the ceremoniale of bishops, maybe in a few other places. But they're no longer, at least in the GIRM, I don't think, I'd have to look. I don't think we don't wear them. Jamaicans never wore berettas. We just have our hoods. So I'm not as knowledgeable about that, but I don't think they're mentioned in the GIRM. But I think they are mentioned in other liturgical books and certainly other documents. So I don't think he would have the right to completely remove them. Remember, in the past, less so today, but in the past, the prohibition on the wearing of clerical gear, clerical clerical garb, was a severe penalty. It was considered a strong penalty on priests. So, and that you could only impose based on a canonical process. So, denying priests the right to wear the vestments that are legal for him to wear would seem to me to require a canonical process. Okay. And I think the reform of the penal law of the church underscores that.
Can a bishop regulate how whether there is a crucifix on the altar or how many candles are on the altar? And does the rubrics actually require a crucifix on the altar?
It doesn't require. It requires it on or near. So it doesn't necessarily say that it has to be on the altar, but it has to be on or near the altar. And then there has to be a certain number of candles. I think again on or near. I'd have to double check the language.
I think it's on. I think it was near. Like 2 candles are required on the altar.
Yeah, you have to have at least 2.
And I think it was they actually require real candles in every church except in St. Peter's.
No.
It's like electric
ones. On the country. Depends on the country. In the United States, you can have an oil lamp for the sacramentary lamp, for the sacrament lamp. So if you have a tabernacle and you want a lamp, you can use an oil lamp for that in the United States. But for the altar, they must be wax candles in the United States. Other places allow you to use oil. So, for example, in the diocese in Italy, the Bishops' Conference of Italy permits the use of oil lamps in place of candles on the altar in Italy. That is not, and I think it's true in Mexico as well, for example. It is not true in the United States. So they must be candles in the United States.
Okay. So a bishop can't regulate that.
He couldn't tell you to use oil lamps.
No. Can he say to use no candles?
No.
Can he say no crucifix?
No, because you have to have one. You have to have one on or near the altar.
Can he say no book stand? Whatever you call the book stand.
No, I think the rubrics permit the use of a book stand or pillow. At least the tradition was a pillow. But I don't think he could.
All right, now
prohibit the use of a missal. I mean, I will say as a priest, I needed to see, right? I mean, the book stand isn't an ornament. It's there to bring the book closer so that I could read it.
Yeah, I know. But if it smells of tradition, some people want to get rid of it.
Oh, that just seems to be very strange. But that's odd to me because it's just an ideology, right? Yeah. And this goes back to really this the thing Benedict was sort of strong to condemn, and that's this treating the council as if, according to the hermeneutic of discontinuity. And that's what some of this is, it seems to me, is that people want to create an artificial discontinuity between what went before the council and what went after, particularly with the liturgy, right? And this, to me, is the great problem. As if the liturgy of the Paul VI, the Missal of Paul VI, is utterly disconnected from the Missal of John the 23rd. And I will say at both ends, right, I sort of want to make this claim, and I think it's problematic. So that's why you can't, and the liturgy itself, right, if you look at the GIRM says within it, when the GIRM is silent on something, I have to look at the language. If you have the missal here, I'll give you the exact language. But basically it says, look, when all of this stuff should be interpreted in accordance with the traditions of the Roman Rite, right? It's the GIRM, it makes very clear that this isn't understood as to being a break with what happened before, except where it's explicit. Right. Otherwise, it should be read and interpreted in accordance with the tradition. And what's that tradition? Well, the Missal of John the 23rd and the Roman missals that went before that. So if you're interpreting the GIRM such that it's removing these elements that were long part of the tradition, I think the GIRM itself is telling you that's not the way to interpret this.
All right. So everything we've talked about in regards to the liturgy, just to recap, because I have a couple follow-up questions. We've talked about ad orientem. We've talked about distribution of communion. We've talked about communion under both species, Latin responses. We've talked about vestments, crucifix, candles. All of this was in reference to the bishop's authority over really any priest in his diocese, not just pastor. So I just want to make sure that I understand that this is not just that a pastor has these liturgical rights and can stand up against the bishop. This is any priest's rights in saying mass in the bishop's diocese. Any priest, an associate pastor, a visiting priest, a retired priest. These are priestly rights in regards to the liturgy, not just a pastor's rights against a bishop.
Right, because they're granted according to the GIRM. The GIRM is an expression of universal law, and therefore grants certain rights according to universal law. and everyone who is subject to them then receives the benefit of them. I mean, so for example, I'll just take another example. The general instructions indicate very clearly that the priest is permitted always to celebrate 3 masses on All Souls Day. Could the bishop say, no, I don't want you to do that. You are limited to 1 mass on Sunday? Obviously, no. Mm-hmm. I mean, the GIRM itself gives the priest the authority to do that, which the bishop can't withdraw because it's in universal law. And if he wanted to, he could apply to the Holy See and say, look, for whatever reason, this doesn't apply in my diocese, and I'm asking for an exception for my diocese. But the Holy See would have to grant that.
Okay, so I think I know the answer, but let's just drill down a little bit more specifically. So a bishop, he is essentially the pastor of his own cathedral, right? I mean, that's not a proper analogy, but there isn't a pastor. He's the guy.
Depends on how they do it, but yeah. I mean, sometimes they'll appoint a rector who serves effectively as
right. So
spiritual leader.
So, but in his own cathedral, can a bishop mandate some of these liturgical practices, and then therefore are the priests that are saying mass at that cathedral, whether the associate pastor or parochial vicar or whoever it is, they're not the pastor of that church. Does that priest have to follow those liturgical practices in the cathedral of the bishop?
It depends on which one, but I would say for the most part, yes. Because he's
they do have to follow.
Yeah, for the most part. It depends on which ones. There are things with the GIRM specifically grants to the priest celebrant to make decisions on. So the priest celebrant can always make decisions on certain things. But otherwise, he's the one that implements the GIRM. And so when there are choices to be made, he's the one, just like the pastor in his own parish, are the ones who are going to be making the decisions within the way in which it's carried out.
So again, it's like if the GIRM or the rubrics or whatever have a provision in there, such as you can have a crucifix on the altar, or you have to
have one in the sanctuary, either on the altar or on the
so
side.
Let's say the bishop in his own cathedral, or let's say the bishop in his own seminary, in his own diocese. Sometimes there's actual seminary.
The rector serves as the liturgical authority for the seminary.
All right, well, we're going to get. All right, so that's a whole nother series of questions. I'm going to ask that in a second. Then I just misspoke then. So let's wait on the rector, because I did not know what you just said, but I had that question of what's a rector in the seminary analogous to a pastor in a parish, but we'll get there in just a second.
Very much.
So the associate parochial vicar, I guess, in a cathedral, the bishop says, okay, in my cathedral, guys, I don't want a crucifix on the altar, and I don't want communion given at the altar rails. And we have those distinctions we talked about. Well, you shouldn't deny people. Yeah. I only want 2 candles on the altar. I don't want more than that. He has these preferences. I don't want fiddlebacks worn in my cathedral. What's the parochial vicar? Can the parochial vicar, now he can get moved any day. I mean, obviously the bishop say, okay, well, you're gone. And I get that. But can the parochial vicar say, no, when I say mass, I have a crucifix and I have candles and I wear these particular vestments. That's what I do because I'm a priest and I have a right, even if I'm in your cathedral.
It's a very good question. It's a very good question. I probably have to think about it some more. Certainly, I think with regards to the placement of things within the sanctuary, whoever the rector of the church is, usually the pastor, or in the case of the cathedral, the appointed rector, the bishop has some authority on how to place those things and to keep them there. I do think there's much more. My sense is, I have to look it up, is that the priest celebrant has much more authority with regards to the vestments he's going to wear. That the GIRM seems to be clearer on those things, that those are under just the purview of the priest who's celebrating the mass. I would be much more likely to say that the priest would be on more solid ground to insist on what vestments he's wearing. Could the bishop say, no, you're not allowed to wear, or you must wear a certain amount of lace on your alb if you're going to celebrate here? I don't think so.
Right.
And he couldn't do it the other way. I don't think you were to have no lace on your alb. That just seems to me outside the purview. I think that leaves that within the individual discretion of the priest. And again, if the bishop disagrees, then his recourse is not to assign the priest to celebrate mass there. Okay. I think. But I think that the makeup of the sanctuary is a little bit different. I think that would be more under the purview of the rector. I'd probably want to do a little research on that first, but that would be kind of my sense. And of course, there are times in which more than 2 candles must be used. So for example, it's very clear when the bishop himself says mass, the bishop of his diocese says mass, even if it's in a church with a diocese, there should be 7 candles, right? That's in the rubrics.
Well, some bishops do not do that.
Well, the preference
sure.
preference from the ceremony is very clear. When the bishop is celebrating mass in his own diocese, it should be 7 candles.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So a bishop saying, no, I only want 2 candles and I want all my priests to use 2 candles.
I don't know.
Could not only be unenforceable in regards to his priest, but it could actually be incorrect in regards to himself.
Certainly with regards to the bishop, it is correct. I'd have to double check on the use of the candles in the GIRM. I don't think there's any. I think the GIRM would permit the use of 6 candles, and you have to have at least 4 for adoration, and you have to have at least 4 on Good Friday, for example, for the events of Good Friday. There must be at least 4. So there are other parts in which the instructions mandate more than 2 candles.
Can you tell us a little bit more about a bishop is supposed to have 7 candles when he celebrates mass?
It's in the ceremonial. So it's a liturgical book passed by the church. It affects. It's where we get, for example, how the priest holds his hands. It's not in the GIRM, but it's in the ceremonial. So the priest should have his hands folded in front of him. We get that, for example, from the ceremonial. But it tells you how to set up the altar before mass when the bishop is celebrating mass within his own diocese. And it says you should have 7 candles. I have to look at. I'm not sure if it says must.
Do you think
but
they
it should
know
say
that?
7?
Do you think bishops know that? Does anybody tell them that in bishop baby school?
I hope so. But it's in English. You can go. I don't think they've done a new translation of it. Hopefully that's on their list. But it is an approved liturgical document. It has the force of liturgical law, and it applies. I mean, I don't know what else to tell you.
Yeah, and I hear you. I'm just surprised. But I think it's interesting that I think a lot of bishops see those kinds of things as recommendations, and then when they want to push their preference, they act like they have authority.
I would say some of the things just so surprising. So, for example, the GIRM is very clear that one of the things that's to be put out at Mass is the communion plate. That is the plate that goes under your chin when they distribute communion.
Yeah.
That's not listed as optional in the GIRM. It's listed among the things to be put out at the beginning of Mass. And I don't know.
So it's quite remarkable that's actually a question I didn't have that I should have concluded. Should have included. It's amazing that it just seems that a number of bishops ignore or are ignorant of the specific rubrics, and then but then try to create their own and enforce it.
Yeah, which
is the opposite, dead opposite, complete contradiction to the requirements from Rome.
Yeah, I don't know how many do it, but I hopefully most of them are just doing out of ignorance. But another one that I run into is, when I purify the vessels, I use the sort of the older way of doing it with wine and water and doing it. And the current GIRM says you can purify the vessels with wine and water, but most priests aren't aware of that. And most churches are. So when I try to purify at the altar with wine and water, I get these surprised looks. Why are you trying to? Well, it's in the GIRM. Read the instructions. I could use wine and water. I am using wine and water. This isn't unusual. This is something that's there. It's part of the tradition. It's the way I do it. But oftentimes it's because the other big problem I always often run into is the GIRM is very clear that in the absence of a deacon, a concelebrant takes the deacon's parts. But I don't know any American priest that knows that. So if there's a priest and there's a concelebrant and there's no deacon, then it's the concelebrant who reads the gospel. It's the concelebrant who prepares the chalice. It's the concelebrant who holds the chalice. It's the concelebrant who dismisses the people. So he takes the part of the deacon. He still wears priestly vestments, but he just takes the part of the deacon. But I don't know any priest, very few priests in the United States that are even aware of that.
I've only seen that in the Latin Mass. I have not seen that.
It's explicit in the Novus Ordo. The preference, for example, the reading of the gospel, the preference in law is that the first preference is the deacon, and if there's no deacon, the second preference is a concelebrant. And if there's no deacon or concelebrant, only then does the pre-celebrant proclaim the gospel. But I don't know that many priests are even aware of that.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's great. There should be a book.
There is. Just read it.
Things that pastors don't know, or something, or just something like that.
Just please read it.
All right. To wrap up this liturgical section.
Sure.
Just one more time, I think it's important. We've listed a lot of things that shows like where the bishop does not have authority over certain things, even if they think they do. And I have a much better understanding now of, they can't just go around and promulgate law that is contrary to an existing law.
Higher law, but there's a hierarchy of law, and you can't have a lower law that contradicts a higher law.
But if they want to pass any kind of law, there is a process for them to attempt to do that.
For a particular law. Mm-hmm.
So tie this section off by speaking to priests or pastors that feel a bit bullied on these kinds of issues, and give them advice, more of spiritual advice on how to cope with this. Now, we've talked about recourse, how we've said, hey, put it in writing, buddy, that kind of thing. But these are priests who can feel that they don't have a spiritual father in their bishop when they're having these kinds of conflicts.
Sure.
So what kind of pastoral advice, for lack of a better word, or spiritual advice would you give them?
Well, I sort of a couple of things first is one, as I say to my seminarians when I teach, is your primary vocation as a parish priest is to love the people entrusted to your care. Always make that first, right? You are given to a certain portion of the people of God as a pastor, and you are to see to their spiritual good, and that is your life. That defines you. Stick to that first and foremost. All right. Hopefully, you're doing that in coordination and cooperation with the bishop, but make sure that whatever you're doing, you're tending to your primary vocation. And when you're running into conflicts with the bishop, I say the first thing to do is try to discern the good the bishop is trying to bring about. He must have some good in his mind that he's trying to bring about. What is that? And how can you cooperate that in the best possible ability that you can? And if so, do that, right? Try to bring about whatever the good is that you think he's trying to bring out. There may be a place in which you think what he's trying to bring out isn't good, and especially when it then starts conflicting with your conscience, that you do have an obligation to obey your conscience, and you need to tell the bishop that when you do your best to try to read the bishop in a good way, you do your best to cooperate with the good the bishop is trying to bring about. But when you come into a clear conflict of conscience into your understanding of the way you have to obey universal law or the traditions of the church or the teachings of the church, in a way that what the bishop commands you is in conflict with that conscience, you need to be honest with the bishop that you are creating, bishop, in me a conscience issue, that I've got a conflict now that I not have to resolve, and I'm asking you to help me resolve that in a good way, and hopefully resolve that not by ignoring my conscience. And I think a good bishop is going to be sensitive to that. I don't think a good bishop wants his priests to have a real conflict of conscience, and wants to find ways to accommodate that. And hopefully that kind of can begin in him a spirit of dialogue. And then I'd say the last thing is that bishops will listen to priests, but they will especially listen to the people. And then a lot of times the priests are going to be in a position to say, there's nothing I can do because this is what the bishop has commanded us to do. So please, people of God, I hear you, I understand you, but I'm not the person to bring your complaints to. Please talk to the bishop to do that. And if it's severe enough and if it's constant enough, I mean, the Holy See wants good bishops to encourage people to say, look, if this is ongoing and if it's really affecting your ability to live out the faith, then you need to let the nuncio know so that Rome knows, so that they can, if it's widespread enough and it's severe enough, if there's a significant enough disconnect between a bishop and the people of the diocese, then hopefully the nuncio, and I think he's a good man. I really do think Christophe Pierre is a good man, and I think he really wants good cooperation between bishops and people. That if he becomes aware of this, he can intervene in a really fraternal way to help the bishop exercise his authority in a better way.
That's wonderful. I got many more questions on other subjects. Not many more, but a few more. But let's take a bio break and get some coffee, and we'll be back.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right. You're welcome.
Welcome back, Father.
Thank you.
We had a great discussion about, really we focused on the liturgical, the limits of a bishop's authority over the liturgical practices of a priest or a pastor. And we covered some great ground. We talked about ad Orientem, we talked about distribution of communion, Latin responses, vestments, candles, all these kinds of things. And kind of how I would summarize it, just to kind of recap, the Holy Mother Church has issued so much clarity on things that are required or things that are optional. And a bishop who comes into a diocese and tries to promulgate his own preferences is limited in doing that by the existing laws in the rubrics or other documents from the church. And if a bishop wants to mandate certain liturgical practices, A, it has to not contradict any higher law, and B, he actually has to issue it as law, and there's a formal process to do that as opposed to just a liturgical preferences document that he publishes out to his priests. Did I get that
Yeah,
right?
I think that's right. It's just a recall, and this is from the Second Vatican Council, is that who has authority over the liturgy? That is the Supreme Pontiff. And a bishop does only in ways in which the law specifically grants it to him. He is not the creator of liturgical law. He is the one who executes it. So it has to be in accordance with the law. Again, principle of legality applies just as much to liturgical law, that he exercises that oversight role in not as the maker of law, but as the one who puts it into practice, who executes it. And so he must execute the law that's given to him by the Supreme Pontiff. At a certain level, the bishops' conference, just the bishops' conference, can make adaptations. And we have many in the United States that have been made by the bishops. But again, that's the bishops' conference, and that's only even approved with the recognitio, with the approval of the Apostolic See. So they can't even do it on their own authority. The bishop has no authority on his own to implement new liturgical law. It's just really none. He only has the power to execute the law given to him by a higher authority.
Now, talk to me about, in terms of the liturgical practices that we've been talking about, the difference in the authority that a religious superior has over his order or his community. Is it any different? Does an abbot of a monastery have more authority, for example, to mandate that that his community functions in certain ways liturgically, or even the use of vestments or things like that? Like where is his authority stronger than that of a bishop's?
It's much stronger because what you have in a religious community is the superior oversees what's called the conventual liturgy. So particularly we're talking mostly clerical or religious institutes. So there are groups of priests there that they often have a common liturgy together. This was true in the older rites before the council, is that there was a main mass for the community called the conventual mass.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, it was always done the same way before the council. There were no options before the council. You just did what the book said. And there was no concelebration or anything. The priest would then go off to say a private mass, oftentimes after attending the conventual mass. These days, the conventual mass is usually concelebrated, so it's one of the religious and concelebrated by the other priests in the community. And to that extent, the superior can somebody has to make distinctions about what's done in the liturgy in terms of the options that are available that can be made. The other thing is, too, obviously, the members of the religious community also take a vow of poverty. So they're not going to have a lot of their own things. Or in fact, if they do have only the things, it's often just for their use, not their ownership.
All right, so they might not have
their own vestments.
And
right.
things.
Those
they got to
belong
use the
to
communities, and the abbot probably gets to choose exactly what the community has.
Or the abbot from 30 years ago.
Right, right.
So it's often it's whatever that's available. So that's that vow. In many ways, it's the vow of poverty more even than the vow of obedience that makes the superior have a bit more authority.
All right. So again, I'm asking a really maybe annoying specific question. Can the Benedictine abbot say no priests in my abbey can say ad orientem, or does that right of ad orientem kind of supersede even an abbot's control?
I think he could do that at the conventual mass. I think the superior could give that requirement for the conventual mass. I don't think he could, as a general matter, say to the abbots, when you say a private mass, when you say a mass outside of the abbot, or a mass other than the conventual mass, that you're limited in terms of ad orientem, because I think it's a right given to the priest otherwise. Right. But I do think he has authority regarding the way in which the conventual mass is celebrated.
I'm all over the map here a little bit, but a fascinating topic, and it's real for a lot of younger priests, particularly. cassocks, the wearing of cassocks. A lot of priests, a lot of young priests particularly.
That's an easy one in America, thankfully. There's a particular law in the United States about clerical dress. So for priests, the ordinary clerical dress is the black suit and Roman collar. But the liturgical norm, the norm in the United States is that clerics, which include deacons, and again, this is the U.S. bishops, not me. Clerics, the U.S. bishops say, may also wear the cassock ad libitum, as according to their own discretion. So,
and that would include a seminarian who's still just a transitional deacon.
The norm in the complementary norm in the United States just says a cleric. So a man is made a cleric as soon as he ordained a deacon. It's very clear under the law that a man who is a deacon has the right under law in the United States to wear the cleric under his own discretion. He can't be forced to wear the cleric. The cassock, the ordinary form is the black suit with the clerical collar, but it is up to his own discretion. The law gives it to his discretion. It's very clear under the law to wear the cassock. So a bishop has no right under law, except through a penal process, to restrict even a deacon seminarian from wearing the cassock. I will say many of them do. It's clearly an abuse of their authority. It's clearly contrary to the norms that they themselves approved, right? The U.S. bishops don't want deacons to wear cassocks, then they should change the law. Otherwise, they need to respect that out of justice, the law that they passed applies to them as well as the seminarians, and any cleric, deacon or priest in the United States, unless prohibited by a canonical penalty, has the right to wear the cassock.
Okay. Let's turn to a different subject matter, and it's more of parish management. So what level of authority does a bishop have over the financial management of a parish in his diocese?
Some, but not directly. The parish is a juridic person under the law, public juridic person under the law, which has a separate reality. It's like a corporation in American law.
Sure.
And it has a legal reality. And the proper administrator, the one who acts legally in its name, is the pastor. So the pastor has the authority to act in the name of the parish, and therefore the one who administers the finances of the parish. The supreme administrator of the church is the supreme pontiff, but that doesn't make the supreme pontiff the supreme owner in the church. He's not the owner of the goods. So who owns the goods, the temporal goods of the parish? Parish does. Who has the decision to decide how those goods are used? The administrator, who is the pastor. Now, the diocese has the right to pass particular law, and there's a wide range that they can do with regards to finances. So in terms of the necessity to make a budget and that sort of things that they can do. There's also some limits in terms of the amount that they can expend. So it's very clear that if they expend certain amounts, they're going to need to get approval from the diocesan bishop and the dioceses are going to have different numbers for that. So
each diocese would have a different limit?
I think the minimum, I'd have to double check on that. It's been a while since I've looked at it for dioceses. There are two amounts in law. It's called the minimum amount and the maximum amount. So the minimum amount triggers the approval of usually a local superior. I think there's one standard in the U.S., depending on whether you are in a diocese with more than 500,000 or less than 500,000. It's like a couple million, I think, that you would have to get approval for. So there's that. And then there's the maximum, if you're at the maximum, which is a much higher number, that you need approval for the Holy See. So there are sort of times in which the pastor, if he's spending enough money, or selling property worth enough, or renting or something like that, he might even need approval from the Apostolic See. If that's a huge number. It's like $11 million or something. It's a massive amount.
Well, but anytime you're building a new church these days, that's going to happen.
You may need approval from the Apostolic See.
So to build a new parish church, just a new church, everything's going to be over $10 million nowadays.
Yeah, I can't remember the $10 million,
but something like that.
It's a very high number.
It's basically believable that if you're building a new parish, the bishop would seek, or the pastor would seek, permission from the Apostolic See.
Yeah. If it involves alienation of property or buying. There's also some dioceses can put some restrictions on what's called extraordinary administration. So if there are other so if you're doing other expenditures that single expenditures that may be below some of those, you may need to seek approval, or outside of an approved budget, you may need to seek approval. So that can be done a little bit diocese to diocese.
Okay, so I can understand.
And they can put requirements. For example, you have to have a finance council. So the diocese must have a finance council. Every parish must have a finance council. And the diocese can put some requirements on size of the finance council, who's on the finance council, what the finance council does, that sort of thing. That's going to limit the bishop. But
all right, so this is important though. Like this is an important structure. You just laid out a structure where there's diocese must have a finance council, parish must have a finance council. Where is that body of law? Like what? It's in the
code. That's in the code. The code gives what the Diocesan Finance Council does. That is, it has to approve the budget, the annual budget, and then it also has to review the statement of accounts at the end of the year. So those two are very clear in law for the Diocesan Finance Council. There's nothing specific in law for the Parish Finance Council. There are no specific. It says you have to have one, but it doesn't say what they do. And I think that the intent of the law is for the diocese to pass particular law saying this is what the Parish Finance Council does. So hopefully every diocese has some particular law that says this is what the Parish Finance Council should do. And it's probably going to be similar to the Diocesan Finance Council. That is, they need to approve the annual budget and they need to review the annual statement of accounts.
So another parish management kind of question back to the topic.
Sure.
Certain ministries in a parish, does a bishop have any authority over saying, I want certain types of ministries to go on in this parish?
No, not that I can think of. The only things in terms of the parish life that must be there, he could mandate, particular law could mandate a pastoral council. Mm-hmm. In universal law, finance councils are mandatory in a parish. Parish councils or pastoral councils are optional. I think under particular law, the bishop could mandate that. I don't think there's any other ministry within the life of the parish that could be mandated under law. There is the principle of subsidiarity, and so these things really are meant to be addressed by, and the pastor has authority. They're meant to be by the pastors. I mean, if the bishop is recommending certain ministries that he wants to see in the diocese, I mean, I think the priest should listen to it and see if they can do it. But every parishes are different.
Yeah. And I've taught Catholic social doctrine at a number of places and different age groups, college and high school level, and I've studied subsidiarity a lot, and I've studied the social doctrines of the church a lot. But one of the things I learned is that it's really a subset of the moral theology of the church and the compendium of Catholic social Catholic doctrine. It's an important document of the church. So one of the overarching questions I was going to have for you in regards to canon law, because I know nothing about canon law, is that we can't really think, well, there's no law that governs that, because I would think if the canon law does not say something explicitly, or we're not able to strongly infer from some other regulation in canon law, then the law that kicks in is subsidiarity, and it would go to the lower level of authority, such as a pastor. And I've just noticed that in more left-leaning, whether it's politics or in church and theology, they do the inverse. So they say, when there's a lack of clarity on something, they give the authority to the higher level of authority, right? And so, for example, if it's not very clear in a civil issue what the controlling body is, the popular opinion is well, the federal government must control it, whereas it should be the other way around.
Right.
And so I would think that, am I right in thinking that subsidiarity is like a veil that's kind of surrounding everything we're talking about in regards to canon law?
Yeah, I remember. Do you remember that the old? You're probably not old enough to remember the old song. It's a bill. It's only a bill sitting here. Well, there was an old commercial that explained how a bill was made a law, but the issue that it was dealing with was clearly a local issue that federalism should have prohibited from being a local law. That is, federalism is just the American version of subsidiarity.
It's beautiful, yeah.
But my favorite is the sort of famous example in entertainment about teaching how a bill becomes a law violates the provisions of federalism and subsidiarity.
Yeah, right.
And you see this in the church too. My favorite example of this is, I've been attentive to the synod and synodality and discussions of synodality, and then there's been discussions of sort of canonical implementations with the synod and synodality and how to implement synodality with regard to the code. And one of the things that I keep hearing is to make pastoral councils mandatory in parishes. I think, well, this describes me as just very strange. So you've got synodality, which seems to suggest that a lot of sort of local conversation, a lot of local involvement of people. And the way we're going to do that is a universal mandate from Rome to the local parish on how they're supposed to operate. And none of the people who are sort of advocating see the irony.
See irony, right?
But it just seems to be. I mean, it may be a good idea. I don't know, but it just seems to be very ironic.
Yeah, it's a tyrannical enforcement of localism.
Yeah,
which is just a
I would say. I mean, I love
maybe not tyrant. Sorry, a little too far.
No, but I know,
not tyrannical,
but authoritarian.
Yeah, authoritarian enforcing localism. Which
but there is,
and
you see this sometimes from officials in the Holy See, this attempt to solve local problems with universal solutions, and that just never works very well. I mean, if there are local problems, find local solutions or local options. And I will say part of that too is that the pastor's a real authority, right?
Yes.
He's not just the bishop's functionary or servant. He's a real authority as the administrator, real authority as the spiritual leader. He has an office in the parish, and the bishop really needs to respect that.
Tan Books is here to help you become a saint. That's why we do everything we do. We publish thousands of titles, literally, that are specifically written to help you get to heaven. Everything from the lives of the saints to the writings of the saints, the greatest doctors of the church, the great spiritual masters, Alphonsus Liguori, St. Francis de Sales, and so on. So please come to tanbooks.com and find the book that God wants you to have right now so that you can get to heaven and be a saint for eternity.
What about the pastor's authority versus the bishop's authority if the parish has a Catholic school associated with it?
Well, it's a good question. Obviously, the diocese can issue sort of norms regarding Catholic education and the running of Catholic schools, and many of them do. But in my experience, that most Catholic schools in the United States are missions of the parish. That is, they're part of the juridic person of the parish, not of the diocese. The diocese, it's often the reverse with high schools. So often what you find in the United States is high schools, if they're diocesan high schools, have a separate juridic person or are directly under the diocese.
Yes.
But elementary schools are not. They are ministries of the parish. That means they're under the authority of the pastor. Again, he's going to be subject to whatever particular law may exist regarding them that's issued by the diocese in terms of educational norms that they need to follow. But the running of it really should belong to the pastor. If the bishop wants otherwise, then he needs to make arrangements for those to come directly under the diocese as a juridic person, or alienate them so that they are separate juridic persons.
Well, usually money's coming up in the issue of architecture, building projects, renovating, and this has happened all the time because we got a lot of old churches and people are especially down here in the South, Father, like we have so many old churches that were founded 100 years ago that are like chapels. And now we have pastors that all the Northerners have moved down. We have to build bigger churches. Whereas up north, parishes are closing down and they're consolidating. Here, we need to put those big, beautiful churches on a big truck somehow and bring them down here. So building projects is like every pastor I know has been dealing with some massive renovation or building project from scratch. What is the bishop's role and the diocesan role in the approval of the blueprints, the designs?
Significant.
Okay, walk us through that.
One, because of the expenditure for money. So almost always those are going to trigger an approval by the diocesan bishop, which means the plans and everything have to be submitted to him. So because he has the right to approve the expenditure of the money, then he has the right to. He's not going to approve it unless he's agreeing with some of the patterns on it or some of the plans on it. And I will say there is a document in the United States, Built of Living Stones, that sort of governs this, and that lays out kind of where the authority of the bishop is. I'd have to look at that to double check exactly how they delineate it. But when the bishops write documents about the authority of bishops, they tend to interpret it in favor of it a great deal of authority to the bishops. When the USCCB is writing a document about the authority of bishops, you can better believe that it's written in favor of the authority of bishops. And it is, that one is. But and again, because it's regarding the expenditure of money, and because from the church's point of view, which we don't always appreciate, sort of the legal mind of the church when it comes to the physical structure of the church is that it will last forever.
Yeah.
Once you build a church, it just is supposed to last. And so you have to go through this incredible process if you're going to tear down a church or use it for something else. So if you build it, it's going to last forever. So you're approving of the church, which is why you want to take it outside of just the pastor. Because this is going to be in the diocese for a very, 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 very long time. So some role of the bishops that's going to be involved.
But what if, so you have a new bishop come into one of these southern dioceses, for example, he's got to come into 30, 40 building projects that are going on at any given moment. What's his authority in changing that which was already approved by a bishop?
I mean, he can, I mean, once approval has been given, I mean, the executive authority of a bishop doesn't end when he dies. So the approval has already been given, is given. So you have a right to continue. Now, the new bishop can, I think, come in and I have to think about it a little bit. He might be able to step in and withdraw that, but he'd have to have a really good reason to do so. And I would really think that would subject to some significant recourse, particularly if he did so without a significantly grave reason and without the normal due process and the consultation that would be required with something like that. It would be very unusual. And I think it would be very difficult for him to do. But if you've gotten, if you've submitted your plan to the diocesan, to the former, if you have a diocesan bishop, you've submitted the plan and he's approved the plan and he's approved the expenditure of funds, I mean, you have the legal right to go forward. And the diocesan bishop who comes after him can't, I don't think can simply, because he doesn't like it, simply withdraw it. There'd have to be, I think, a proportionately grave reason. I'd have to think about that. But for him to withdraw to approve that's already been given, right? Because once the approval has been given, it's been given.
I think we're hitting on an important subject.
Yeah.
Because again, if you were made a bishop tomorrow, which I hope you are, Bishop Pius, right?
And it's not going to happen.
And you go into any diocese that's booming, any diocese that's growing, which is usually just geographically, more in the South, you're going to step into 20 or 30 or 40 projects that are underway.
Sure. Yeah. I would have to ask sort of why is the bishop then, if a new bishop is coming in withdrawing approval for approval that's already been given, why is he doing
because he doesn't want, let's just say this hypothetical bishop doesn't want traditional architecture being used, being
I just don't think that's, if he states it that way, that's certainly not.
No, I don't think they would, but whether
it
could be beautiful stained glass windows. It could be the way the altar is designed. It could be the communion rails that we've talked about before. It could be side altars. All these things that smell of a more traditional church. Progressive bishops don't want it.
I remember when I won't say which diocese, but when we renovated one of our parishes, we didn't call them side altars, we called them horizontal worship spaces. And that got
solved it.
That got it through the Diocesan Liturgical Commission
That's awesome.
at the front end. But again, and I do think there's a real problem and a real legal problem with the expectations of justice for a bishop, particularly to withdraw approval that has previously been given without sufficient legal reason.
It's good to hear.
I think that both as a legal matter, but especially as a matter of natural justice, right? Because we talk about sort of reliance issues when we talk about law as common law issues. Your detrimental reliance on people, and that causes you harm. That can raise legal causes in common law. I think you should think about the same principles with canon law and the exercise of a legal act. So when an authority issues a legal act and somebody acts themselves in reliance on that, I think it's very dangerous for a bishop successor to withdraw that legal act because the person has relied on the previous action. not only as a financial matter, but as a matter of just strict justice, right? Because once you've received the benefit of that legal act, right, then it inures to you, right? So I mean, justice is about giving another what is due to him. That now becomes due to me because a legitimate legal authority has given me the right to do so. And now you're withdrawing something that has become my legal right. There's a problem of natural justice in doing that, particularly for a light reason or for a reason not grounded significantly in law.
Okay.
I mean, I can see doing that if you're a bishop that comes into an area and you look at this plan, and now you look at the money they raised and you say, well, by this point, you thought you were going to raise 3 times this amount. You don't have nearly an amount of money to pay for this plan of yours. Like, that is something you'd say, stop. Let's get these finances under control and do something like that. Or, we were going to build this big church in this area 2 years ago, but a major employer that was in the area unexpectedly shut down. The neighborhood has emptied out. And so the people that we thought were going to be here aren't going here. So why are we now building this giant church here? Let's stop and think about it. So if you've got compelling reasons that suggest that this project should stop, I mean, I think that's open for reconsideration. But I don't like this particular artistic flourish as opposed to that one. So we're gonna withdraw approval for this entirely.
Okay.
I mean, that's just a matter of natural justice.
So that's a matter of withdrawing a previously granted approval for a building project. So let's take an example of a priest he has to build a new church, right? A pastor's building a new church. He is a pastor, not an administrator. He's a pastor. He wants to put the tabernacle in the middle, and he wants to put altar rails, and he wants to put an elevated ambo. I guess, you walk up the steps. And he submits the drawings, and the bishop says, I don't want the tabernacle in the middle. I don't want altar rails, and I don't want an elevated ambo. Can the pastor do anything about that? Or is the bishop, just because it's a new church and it hasn't been approved before, does the pastor just prevail and basically gets to be the chief architect? No, I mean,
the bishop does have some rights regarding what he'll approve and what he'll not, and what he won't in terms of standards. But he has to have reasons, and those reasons cannot just simply be arbitrary.
Okay, but you say like elevated ambos are look to authoritarian and are offensive to people in the pews. So we don't want that.
Yeah, I would say that's not in accord with law. That the law certainly permits those sorts of things, and you'd have to have a reason that's rooted in the law to deny something like that. And absent that, one could take recourse to the dicastery in Rome and say, this is an exercise of authority outside the bounds of law, or a reason that is outside the bounds of law. And so Holy See, could you inform the bishop that he cannot, in fact, make these decisions? So I do think something like that would be an item that you could legitimately have recourse on.
So again, the bishop says, in hypothetical, the bishop says, no, you're pastor, I do not want you building in altar rails because receiving on the knees is arrogant and it's just show off. And so I don't want altar rails. I will not approve these blueprints with altar rails.
That's a tougher one, I think. So a couple of things. One, the general instructions are very clear that one must delineate the sacristy as a place separate from the rest of the church. So there's a variety of ways that you can do that. Rails around the altar has been one of the traditional ways to do that.
That's an interesting distinction.
So I wouldn't call them communion rails. I would call them sanctuary rails, and say this is in accordance with the GIRM's instruction about delineating the presbyterium, which is what the GIRM instructs you to do. Usually you do that. You can also do that by elevating that and by different materials that are are the floor.
Now you sound like a lawyer, man.
Oh, yeah.
It's awesome. What'd you call them? Horizontal worship spaces?
Sure. And sanctuary.
You're being a great lawyer now. That's awesome.
Well, the difficulty of that, of course, is that and that's where I do think he has some more a legal basis, is that the ordinary form of receiving communion in the church in the United States is standing, not at the
right. So
rail.
The bishop can cite that and say, no, altar rails.
What's the point of why are you adding this rail when this is not part of the liturgical custom? And your response is, well, they're not communion rails, right? What these are ways for delineating the sanctuary, to reserve them off as a holy space within the holy space, which is what the GIRM intends. And the funny thing is, you go all over Europe, and lots of places in Europe have gotten rid of all their altar rails. You know what they have now? they have these little ropes that say, please do not enter the sanctuary.
Right.
But there is I do think, and it isn't just a legal joke. I do think there is a reason that you would want to separate it out, so that people don't understand that this is a holy place where the altar is, and so that the GIRM is very clear. I don't know if it mentions the rail specifically, but it's very clear that the sanctuary should be set apart.
Separate. Yeah, and we're not like the Eastern Church with the whole...
The anastasis, but the rail was a kind of, finds its origin in the anastasis. And the other thing is, and I do think this is a shame, the loss of this from the council, is that the altar rail was an extension of the altar, right? This is why you had a cloth on it. Oftentimes the top of the altar rail was the same material as the altar, so that you had stone there and stone there. You had a cloth over it as well, so that became the extension of the altar. It's the way in which the people of God approach the altar for the reception of communion. I think the break from that, I think, is tragic. And then we often talk about the sort of the symbolism that goes along with the Holy Communion. I think we've lost that sense of symbolism about that connection between the rail and the altar.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Now, if you don't have all your canon law books here, but if it really got down on a building project to pastor versus bishop on something like altar rails,
I think the Holy See would uphold the bishop.
Uphold the bishop.
Yeah, certainly on something like altar rails. Yeah.
Okay, now side altars.
Again, I think because there's only supposed to be one mass at a time, it's one issue to destroy side altars that are already there. I think there's a good argument to me legally that the law wants those protected, particularly if they have artistic or cultural importance or the like. But adding them to a new church, I think the bishop would be in his right to say there's no need for side altars in a church because you can only have one mass at a time according to the new rubrics, and therefore not to have those.
So what would examples be?
That's why you have horizontal worship spaces.
Right, exactly. I gotcha. Now, what would be examples for this pastor in building a new church that he would have authority over, if that's the right word? I mean, the stained glass windows, placement of the tabernacle, like what else? I mean, the choosing of which altar he's going to put in there, choosing whether there's like an old school high altar in the back. Like what is the artwork, the Stations of the Cross?
Hopefully it's not. I will say
the baptismal font. Like, what does he have authority over?
Well, a lot of those are required. A lot of those are within the law. For example, the preference of the law, for example, for a parish church, it should be a stone altar. You can have wood, but it should be immovable. That should be built in. You might have some wood as the base, but it should be built in, and you shouldn't be able to sort of lift it up and move it to the side. That's a problem.
But is there specific laws that would govern? Like, how are you conclude? Like, I understand the communion rail issue because you're looking at the norm for. Like, I see that you're looking at the norm that this country has for receiving communion standing. Yep. That's the basis of that authority there. When there's not a basis of authority on such as how nice is the baptismal font, or something like that, or whether the ambo is elevated or not. Like, I suspect there's not norms for these things. Mm-mm. So in the absence of a norm, would you say then the bishop has to have an extraordinary reason to overturn a pastor's decision on the architecture?
I think practically probably not, because oftentimes it is in conjunction with what the bishop will do is just sort of merge that with the approval for the expenditure. Mm-hmm. And so he'll say, look, I'm not going to approve this expenditure, but if you change these things, I'll approve them. So it becomes effectively...
It's a very practical side here.
Okay. It becomes effectively the way to do it. But I will say, and I hope I do think the way to solve this is a couple things. One is the diocese should have norms in terms of liturgical building, and that should be what guides. And if a new bishop comes in and there are already liturgical norms, he should respect those. And if he wants to change those, it should be in dialogue with. He's got a presbyteral council. Hopefully, he's got a diocesan pastoral council. If he wants to change those and update those, then do those in dialogue with these, right? If synodality means anything, it should be these things. It shouldn't be just here are my preferences in the churches. And the same thing is true when you're building a new church. I mean, this shouldn't just be the bishop. This shouldn't just be the pastor. This should be the people who are involved in it as well. So you've got the people of a particular parish who are building this church. Absolutely, they should be involved in the planning of this. I mean, obviously not every single one of them, but hopefully there is a group of them who are involved. Hopefully there are options for them to give their input on what things look like. And when that happens, when this is done in dialogue, when there are norms that are issued by the general norms that are issued by the diocese that are taken seriously by the parish, and the pastor works with the people in the parish and the experts that he needs, then and the bishop then respects this process. I mean, if that's not a synodal process, I mean, I just don't know what is.
Right.
And if the bishop doesn't want to respect the synodal process, I mean, I don't know what else to say.
Yeah, no, it's very good. But I think in terms of the specifics of architecture, it's a very important distinction. Has it already been approved by the previous
it is,
bishop or
I
not?
think.
So you drew a hard distinction there, and I like that. But I also, I appreciate hearing that in terms of new architecture, new approval process, a bishop,
He's got a lot of authority.
He's got a lot of authority because he can approve the expense or not.
Yeah.
And
the same thing is usually going to be true with renovations because, again, they usually involve a very large expenditure.
Yeah, so there's some kind of
the bishop.
diocese. So if it's a $20,000 statue that the pastor's putting in, it probably doesn't invoke diocesan approval.
Probably not.
Yeah,
If it's a single, but if it's a complete redo,
if they're putting on a new roof, you're in millions, and you're going to end up invoking the bishop.
Yep.
I get it. What about? Let's change. So that was very helpful for me. Church architecture, building projects, because that has got to be a very common thing that pastors deal with all over this country. If they're renovating an old church up there in New York, or they're doing a new one down here, and the bishop and them have totally different views on architecture, I could see that just being a normal point of contact.
I would say there are norms in the general instructions. Built of Living Stones, which is the USCCB, doesn't have the force of law, but hopefully that will guide and avoid. If you can turn to that and say, "Look, bishop," or this is in the bishop's document on this. Why can't I do this? When you bishops have approved this document that says all the other bishops seem to think this is okay. Why don't you?
What about, so we've talked about parishes, we've talked about the liturgy, we've talked about building projects and finances. Another major area of a bishop's authority, and I would think it's very extensive authority, is over priestly formation. And so...
Yes and no.
Well, talk to me about that.
Okay. Much of that is actually done by the Holy See. So the Holy See issues a document that governs priestly formation for the whole Latin Church.
Yes.
So there's a document, and then there's an adaptation of that that's done by the Episcopal Conference. The current one is usually known as the PPF, the Program for Priestly Formation in the U.S. We're on the 6th edition. That took a great deal of wrangling between the dicastery and the U.S. bishops over a couple of sticking points, but it's finally approved. So that sets the standard. And so the standard of that, both formation-wise and particularly academic-wise, then is given to the rector to enforce. So the rector then puts together the program of priestly formation. So much of that is governed by these higher-level documents, both from the Apostolic See and from the Episcopal Conference. So, I don't know how much the individual bishop always has the right to decide who he's going to ordain and who he's not. It's his decision. Right. Hopefully, he's making good decisions about this. But the seminary can say, "You absolutely, this is a great guy. Please ordain him." And the bishop could say, "No." And sometimes, as it happens, I've worked in a seminary. You should not ordain this guy. What are you? Please don't ordain this guy. And the bishop goes, "I'll do it anyway." So sometimes that happens. But in terms of the actual program, of the particulars of the program of priestly formation, much of that is already determined before the bishop gets involved.
Yeah, as the general rules, but the running of a seminary
is the rector. So the rector again, a seminary is under law a public juridic person, its own public juridic person. It has separate legal existence from the diocese, and it has its separate administrator, which is the rector. And under canon, the rector is really almost a pastor as well. So under canon law, the seminarians who are part of that seminary are removed from the parochial system. So they're not subject to the local pastor. They're subject to the rector as their proper pastor. So he has control over the formation, the rector does, control over the academics, and control over the pastoral care of the men in the cemetery. He does. And so if the bishop doesn't like that, his recourse is to replace the rector.
Now, so by way of analogy, the rector is sort of like a pastor at a parish.
Even broader because he's involved with much more of their daily life.
Okay.
But he is absolutely the one responsible for their spiritual care.
Now,
and he has the authority of a pastor over the men who are at his seminary.
But in regards to a pastor, and we talked about this before, a bishop doesn't just willy-nilly remove a pastor, right? He can transfer him. We talked about that a little bit, but if the pastor says, no, I don't want to leave, I want to stay at my parish, the bishop has to kind of go to some extreme lengths to remove that pastor to another parish, does he not? Mm-hmm. What about in regards to a rector? Is it easier for the bishop to pull the trigger and say, you're out of here?
It depends. So because it's a public juridic person, most public juridic persons have statutes. And a rectory has statutes, and those statutes are going to govern the hiring and the removal of the rector. So it'll depend on, and the bishop has to, because it is an ecclesiastical office, he has to follow the proper procedures for the removal of somebody from an ecclesiastical office, which includes the respecting of the statutes. And the statutes are, I'd have to double check. I think they're still approved for a seminary, still approved by the dicastery for clergy, so from the Holy See. So almost certainly the statutes of the seminary will have a process regarding the removal of the rector, and I don't think most of them are simply for any reason. There usually has to be cause, probably consultation. There's usually a board of trustees or board of directors. It's usually done in and through them as well.
Okay.
So it depends on what the statutes say. But
do you know what the statutes would say about the reasons that would have to be there for a rector to be removed?
Usually for the things you expect, for maladministration, or heresy, schism, that sort of thing, or significant other grave cause.
So if those aren't there, and a bishop wants to remove a rector,
usually has to wait for the end of the term.
Depends. There's terms?
So generally speaking, the same is true of pastors.
I didn't know
in the United
pastors
States
had terms.
So yes, so in the United States, I should have mentioned. So that's the easiest way to remove the pastor is wait till his term ends. So in the United States, you have two options, and only two. You can appoint a pastor for an indefinite term, that is, he stays there forever, or you can appoint him to a 6-year term.
Is that you? Okay, so
that's in the United States. So those are your two options.
Most pastors have one or the other?
All pastors in the U.S. must have one or the other.
Right, but do they have one or the other, like generally speaking?
They in the United States, it's generally 6 years.
Really?
Generally, you're at a 6-year term. They can be renewed, and they often are renewed. Many dioceses, it's sort of normal.
So when when the term expires, the bishop, just by the swipe of a pen, can okay.
Yep.
Interesting.
So at the end of the term, he doesn't need a grave cause to remove him anymore.
Same thing with a rector.
He just needs a just cause.
And you think the term limit is generally similar for a rector?
I have to. Yeah, it's going to depend. You don't want too short of a term for a rector, but it's going to be term limited. And the Holy See, I think, will demand a term limit for a rector.
Right.
And normally what you do is, so you don't automatically lose your position, even a pastor, at the end of the expiration. So there always has to be an exercise of authority to remove you even after a time period. So sometimes pastors there for 6 years, they don't hear anything from the bishop. They're still pastor. You're pastor until the bishop says, I now realize that you're a pastor term. Now you're removed as the pastor because you're pastor term. Same thing would be from a rector. Term expires, and usually either it's going to be the board of directors or maybe the ordinary then says your pastor term. So now the position is vacant.
Fascinating. Okay, that's great. I just wanted to kind of return. We mentioned something a little bit in passing in regards to a bishop approving of the creation of a religious order in their diocese, or religious orders moving into the diocese, or in terms of a religious order moving out of a diocese, or just the general authority of a bishop over a religious order and how they function. how does that all work?
A much longer story.
I just asked like a whole book full of questions.
Yeah,
but
and there are very different answers for each of them. So generally speaking, right now, the Holy See, the Holy Father changed this recently. So a bishop no longer has the authority to erect what's called a religious institute of diocesan right. So a new religious order is the old term, and it had a very specific meaning. But we would say today a religious institute or a society of apostolic life. But we'll stick to religious institute, which is what we mean by when we say religious order. So in the past, the bishop had a great deal of discretion in establishing a new religious institute within his diocese. That has been withdrawn by Pope Francis. A bishop cannot even erect what's called a public association of the faithful that's thinking about becoming a religious institute without the approval of the Apostolic See. The Apostolic See thinks the bishops have been approving these far too easily, and so has put the brakes on it significantly. So the bishop no longer has the authority to do that himself. So he can't create one without Rome's approval. In terms of allowing in, the bishop has the right to approve the erection of a religious house. So every religious live in what are called houses. It's the canonical term. So the religious community can erect a house, but if you want to erect it in a diocese, it has to do so with the permission of the local ordinary, the diocesan bishop. So in that sense, you can't come into a diocese. That is, you can't erect a house in a diocese without permission. You don't need his permission to leave. You just notify him.
What about kicking religious communities out of a diocese?
Yeah, absolutely. The bishop can do that. You can tell them they're no longer welcome and they have to leave.
All right, really? So let's take like a radical example. Like you take some.
It's still their property. He can't steal their property from them. If they have property in there, it's still theirs. But he can withdraw his permission for them to stay.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so you take some.
Happened to us pretty recently.
Can you tell me about that?
Let's not.
Okay.
I'll tell you off air.
So it's interesting. I mean, but you just think about like certain old religious communities, like a Benedictine order, right? I mean, there's been Belmont Abbey Monastery in this diocese for 150 years. And you just kind of think of it as its own self-subsisting thing, you know.
It is its own self-subsisting thing. Now, yeah.
But how could a bishop just say, you're out of here? I mean, would they have to prove, like, is there a canonical process? Like a darn good reason?
Process, but you'd always have to have, anytime you exercise authority within the church, it has to do so with a reason.
Like, would the Pope have to say, yep, Belmont Abbey, you got to leave? It's a terrible example because Belmont Abbey's not going anywhere.
Yeah.
But they're right down the street.
I'd have to think about it because what you have with Belmont Abbey is what's called a sui juris monastery. It only exists as the monastery, and those have certain extra, those are much more under the authority of the Supreme Pontiff, of the Apostolic See. So that might be much harder to do, and certainly would be much harder to do if it were nuns. Nuns are another matter. That is cloistered nuns. Those are very much under the Holy See. Those are the
so it's harder for a bishop to get rid of cloistered nuns.
Because those are really under the Holy See. I'd have to look at the law a little bit on those. Certainly, like an order with multiple houses like mine or other religious institutes, that's a little bit easier to keep them. But again, keep in mind, I will say, to the extent that they own the house, it's still there. The bishop can't. I remember stories of some bishops in certain continents who tried to steal the property or take the property thinking it's theirs, but the religious institute is a juridic person, and the houses of religious institutes are juridic persons which are capable of ownership, and to take the goods that they own is what we call theft. So you may be able to tell them to leave the diocese, but it's still their property, and so they still have the right to that property.
We've covered a ton of subjects, just all so fascinating. Your knowledge of this is incredible. The purpose of this, Father, for me was A, I'm just darn curious of all this, but more importantly, B, I get the sense that priests are not necessarily very knowledgeable on a lot of these subjects. And I guess you have seen that firsthand, even though they go to seminary and they probably take some intro to canon law class, they don't know these things.
Yeah.
And so I'm hopeful that priests all over the country listening to these, that it will help shape their minds on how this whole process works. So any last thoughts you would have, advice to priests, to pastors, on, how to navigate these things, particularly when they find themselves, very unfortunately, in some kind of conflict with their bishop. No priest wants to have conflict with their bishop any more than a son wants to have conflict with his father. So it's a painful thing when it happens, and I'm sure you've seen this many, many times.
Oh, yeah.
So, just as we wrap up here, what's the final advice that you would give to priests in this sort of situation?
So I often tell my students, there are things worth falling on your sword over and things not. So pick your battles. Don't pick silly ones. Pick important ones and ones in which you think you're right. The second one is clearly if you think the law is on your side or if there's a question about the law, seek out some people who have some knowledge about that. There are a lot of good, and especially a lot of good lay canonists in the United States as well. In the United States. So seek out some good legal advice on what your legal rights and duties are, particularly if you have an office like a pastor or something like that. And then, I do think prayer is an important thing. If there is a conflict, is that your first thing to do should be to take it to prayer, is ask for the wisdom of the Holy Spirit to guide you and to ensure that you're doing the right thing, that you're doing it to purify your motives, to make sure you're doing the right reason, and to help do the same thing for the bishop so that the bishop can see things clearly. And hopefully, I often find that one of the big problems, whether it's married couples or whether it's priests and bishops or religious and their superiors, is communication. Learning to really listen to people, I keep saying this, listen to the good that the bishop is trying to bring about and help your bishop and really be active in cooperating with that good and maybe making suggestions about what the good the bishop wants to bring about, the means he's using aren't the best way, and you may have some ideas for some better means. But giving him in such a way is that you're helping him understand we're on the same side, we're trying to bring about the same good. Let's think about the means that we're using to bring about that same good. And sometimes that can help as well. And sometimes the grace of the Holy Spirit can break down some of the stubbornness that both sides have on these things and come to what is hopefully a mutually agreeable consensus and decision. Because I think in the battles over things, what can be lost is the ultimate goal, which is the good of the people of God. You don't have the role as a bishop for your own good. You don't have the role of a pastor for your own good. You have both of those are oriented and geared towards the other, and that is the good of the people of God. And that should always be the question. Always, always, always be the question. What is the best for the people of God in this situation, and how do we together bring that about? And always to keep that end in your mind, even when you can get caught up in the weeds of an individual struggle.
Father Pius, thank you for your priesthood, for your ministry, and thank you for being here on the show.
Well, thanks for having me. It's really been a delight. I love Charlotte, and I love coming down.
All right, we'll do it again sometime.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Maybe I'll come to Rome and we'll film there.
Anytime,
All right.
anytime.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, thanks guys for checking out the Conor Gallagher Show. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, or comment, or whatever you got to do to support it. And I appreciate that very much.